All right, so let's begin today's readings with the Aryapariyesana Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 26, another good example of a variant in names, right? In this case, not just a variant spelling in names, but two different titles. So again, the variant readings here will show us that in the Burmese tradition, they call this the Pasarasi Sutta, the heap of snares, whereas in the Buddha Jayanti and Pali Text Society editions, it's called the Aryapariyesana Sutta, the Noble Search. So, like I said, usually use the Sinhalese reading, which is in this case the Aryapariyesana Sutta, but also it's a nicer title. I don't know. Okay, it's more meaningful actually. Relates to the theme better. Anyway, I'm not going to read through this whole sutta because a large part of this sutta overlaps with the Mahasacika Sutta that we read yesterday. So I'm just going to focus on some of the portions, and especially looking, because this is the sutta that more than any other lays out and states what the Buddha was doing when he left home. What was his noble quest? So I have heard at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Then the Buddha robed up in the morning and, taking his bowl and robe, entered Savatthi for alms. Then several mendicants went up to Venerable Ananda and said to him, "Reverend, it's been a long time since we've heard a Dhamma talk from the Buddha. It would be good if we got to hear a Dhamma talk from the Buddha." Okay, so let's just stop there for a moment. Buddha lived for 45 years teaching, and they're saying for a long time they haven't heard a Dhamma talk, right? What was he doing? Off on retreat? Didn't feel like giving a teaching? Yeah? Gone somewhere else maybe? Yeah, gone traveling? And they didn't have YouTube, right? They didn't have their library of Dhamma books to look up. Right? If the teacher wasn't around, they had nothing. Yeah? I mean, and it's interesting, like we've gone to this state of such astonishing abundance of Dhamma and Dhamma teachings, you know. It's easy to overlook how recently that is the case, right? I mean, it wasn't long ago that even in monasteries, it was difficult to find very many Dhamma books and Dhamma teachings, right? Yeah, sure, you'd have some, but you know, like even when I arrived at Wat Nanachat, I mean, a well-known international monastery, they didn't have translations of all the suttas when I first arrived there in the early 90s. You know? And, you know, I had to hound the abbot and say, "No, we're missing this and we're missing that. We have to order them." You know? And not long before that, you know, like one of the stories from, again, one of the well-known stories from Ajahn Chah was when one of the Western monks was sent away to a branch monastery, little hermitage somewhere, and there was just him and, you know, maybe one other old monk or something like that, and there was no teacher, no teaching, and they didn't have a library or any books. And when Ajahn Chah visited, he said, "How are you going?" to the monk. And the monk said, "Terrible. I've got no one here to teach me." And the Buddha said, "What are you talking about?" Sorry, Ajahn Chah said, "What are you talking about? You've got 6 teachers." He said, "6 teachers? I don't even have one teacher." He said, "Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. 6. Huh? And so, you know, we put so much emphasis these days on learning through talks, learning through books, and all of these kinds of things. Enough, yeah? Just enough is okay, yeah? You don't need to be listening to Dhamma talks all the time. You don't need to be reading, you know, to read a little bit of suttas each day, yeah? A little bit. Remind yourself, yeah, and learn something new each day is good, but doesn't have to be a whole lot all the time. Mostly in here. This is the real learning. Yeah? All right. Anyway, so the monks eventually got fed up with the Buddha not giving any Dhamma talks. Okay, what do? Well, reverends, so Ananda's the go-between. Well, reverends, go to the Brahman Ramaka's hermitage. Hopefully you'll get to hear a Dhamma talk from the Buddha. It's an unusual situation, isn't it? Yeah, we don't quite know what's happening, but it's a bit unusual. Okay, yes, Reverend, they replied. After the meal, On his return from alms round, the Buddha addressed Ananda. So again, just to notice, right throughout the suttas, the Buddha always going on alms round every day. Come, Ananda, let's go to the eastern monastery, the stilt longhouse of Migara's mother, for the day's meditation. So the Buddha's still around. He's not like in soul retreat or anything like that. He's going, we're going to do some meditation, but he's not necessarily giving teachings all the time. So this is one of the famous monasteries in Savatthi, as well as the Jetavana. Migara's mother, of course, was Visakha, and the famous story was that her father was actually Migara, and because she taught him or led him to the Dhamma, she was known as Migara's mother. And the building is a pasada. Yeah? Pasada is usually translated as palace, but that gives quite, I think, the wrong impression. A palace, you think of like a Disney palace, spires and turrets and all of these kinds of things. And so through research that Venerable Brahmali and I did, it seems clear that a pasada was a stilt longhouse. Yeah? So it would be like a central or a main building in the village. So obviously quite a large building, can be multiple stories. And it was used by the wealthy, as in this case, or by kings and so on. But it wasn't specifically a palace. Yes, sir, said Ananda. And so Ananda went with, the Buddha went with Ananda to the eastern monastery. In the late afternoon, the Buddha came out of retreat and addressed Ananda. Come, Ananda, let's go to the eastern gate to bathe. Yes, sir, Ananda replied. So the Buddha went with Ananda to the eastern gate to bathe. When he had bathed and emerged from the water, he stood in one robe, drying himself. Then Ananda said to the Buddha, Sir, the hermitage of the Brahman Ramaka is nearby. It's so delightful, so lovely. Please visit it out of compassion. So he's not telling the Buddha why he's getting him to go there, right? Again, it's kind of interesting, like what's going on. But I always love these little passages and little vignettes from the suttas because they always show the Buddha being so normal. He's not like flying through the air and shooting off rays everywhere and all of this kind of stuff. No. I'm just, let's go over there and do some meditation, and then, now we'll go and have a bath, and we'll have a bath, and it just lives a normal, simple life. So, they went to the Brahman Ramaka's hermitage. At that time, several mendikas were sitting together in that hermitage, talking about the teaching. The Buddha stood outside the door, waiting for the talk to end. When he knew the talk had ended, he cleared his throat and knocked with the latch. The mendicants opened the door for the Buddha. He entered the hermitage where he sat on the seat spread out and addressed the mendicants. Mendicants, what were you sitting talking about just now? What conversation was unfinished? So can you imagine that? How embarrassing, right? You're sitting in there doing some talk about Dhamma or something. The Buddha comes up and he's waiting outside the door for you to finish. Right? Yes?
Is there any significance to the Buddha consenting in silence, his disposition, or the aspect of speech?
Yeah, that's a kind of a standard idiom. I think it meant he did like this. Yes, it's okay. But yeah, normally in when the Buddha would consent, he would consent with silence. And if somebody, but there are some other idioms as well, like sometimes if somebody wants to offer something to the Buddha or one of the monks and they don't really want to receive it, then they'll say, oh, that's very kind of you to offer that. Something like that. Yeah. So these are kind of very polite idioms that they use. So, yes, I could just imagine this would be very mortifying as a Dhamma teacher if I was just, sitting here going on and the Buddha was at the door waiting for me to finish. I'd be so very, very embarrassed. But anyway, but it shows the Buddha's great respect for the monks, right? He wasn't going to interrupt them, and respect for the Dhamma. Yeah. Very beautiful gesture. All right. Oh, unfinished discussion on the teaching was about the Buddha himself when the Buddha arrived. Good mendicants, it's appropriate for gentlemen like you who have gone forth in faith from the lay life to homelessness to sit together and talk about the teaching. When you're sitting together, you should do one of two things: discuss the teachings or keep noble silence. Okay, so noble silence is different from a vow of silence, right? The mugabbata. Mugabbata is we're not going to talk no matter what. A noble silence means we're not going to talk unless there's a need. And also noble silence is defined by the Buddha elsewhere as the second jhana. So the Buddha had standards, is all I'm saying. There are these two searches, the noble search and the ignoble search. What is the ignoble search? It's when somebody who is themselves liable to be reborn seeks what is also liable to be reborn. Themselves liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted. They seek what is also liable to these things. And what should be described as being liable to be reborn? Partners and children, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs and elephants and cattle are liable to be reborn. These attachments are liable to be reborn. The word for attachments here is upadaya. Upadi. The form is upadayo. Upadi is the word. Someone who is tired, infatuated, and attached to such things, being themselves liable to be reborn, seeks what is also liable to be reborn. And what should be described as liable to grow old? Partners and children, male and female bondservants, goats and sheep, chickens and pigs, and elephants and cattle. What is liable to fall sick? The same thing. What is liable to die? The same thing. And what is liable to sorrow? The same thing. And liable to corruption, and so on and so forth. Elephants and cattle. And with the liable to corruption, we also have the addition of gold and money, jata rupang. So jata, this is I think, I can't recall exactly, but I think a textual variation. I think in some places they have jata rupang for all of them, and some places they have jata rupang just at the end. But so the Buddha is saying jata rupang are liable to corruption. What is that? So this is the ignoble search. So what is the noble search? It's someone who is themselves liable to be reborn, understanding the drawbacks in being liable to be reborn, seeks the unborn supreme sanctuary, extinguishment, or nibbana. Themselves liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, understanding the drawbacks in these things, they seek the unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted, supreme sanctuary, extinguishment, nibbana. This is the noble search. Mendicants, before my awakening, when I was still unawakened but intent on awakening, I too, being liable to be reborn, sought what is also liable to be reborn. Myself liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, I sought what is also liable to these things. Then it occurred to me, why do I, being liable to be reborn, grow old, fall sick, sorrow, die, and become corrupted, seek things that have the same nature? Why don't I seek the unborn, unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted, supreme sanctuary, extinguishment? Sometime later, while still black-haired, blessed with youth in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise, weeping with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, dressed in ochre robes, and went forth from the lay life to homelessness. And so from here follows the encounters with Alara Kalama and then Uddaka Ramaputta, just as we looked at yesterday. And this particular sutta is now telling that same story, but it's framing it differently. So remember yesterday the framing was in terms of development of mind and development of body. Here it's framed in terms of the noble quest. And I think this context is really important to remember when understanding the meaning of these encounters with Uddaka Ramaputta and Alara Kalama. The Buddha wasn't, the purpose, the reason the Buddha left these teachers was because they were not fulfilling the quest that he was on. Yeah? They led only to the rebirth in the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. He was looking for that which is not reborn. Okay? Now, again, just stop for a moment and reflect and consider how mysterious and profound the Buddha's search really was. Right? To imagine that, because at this stage he doesn't know. Yeah? He knows that this is what he wants. He's looking for this thing, but he's tried everything. He's gone to all of the best places, studied with all of the best teachers, practiced as hard as he possibly can, and nothing has worked. Yeah? And most of us would probably have given up long before then. But the Buddha keeps on going. So then, again, he went to Uruvela. This particular discourse doesn't talk about the period of self-mortification, but it goes to Uruvela, and then he's on so being myself liable to be reborn, understanding the drawbacks in being liable to be reborn, I sought the unborn supreme sanctuary extinguishment, and I found it. Nibbanang ajhagamang. Being myself liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, understanding the drawbacks in these things, I sought the unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted supreme sanctuary extinguishment, and I found it. Knowledge and vision arose in me. My freedom is unshakable. This is my last rebirth. Now there are no more future lives. Akupa me vimutti ayamantima jati natidani punabhavoti. So this is one of the places in the suttas that talks about that moment of enlightenment. Actually, the time, that night of enlightenment, is spoken of in many places in the suttas from different angles and different perspectives. And this one is framing it in terms of the noble quest. Then it occurred to me, this principle that I've discovered is deep, hard to see, hard to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond the scope of logic, subtle, comprehensible to the astute. But people like attachment. They love it and enjoy it. It's hard for them to see this thing, that is specific conditionality, dependent origination. It's also hard for them to see this thing, that is the stilling of all activities, the letting go of all attachments, the ending of craving, fading away, cessation, extinguishment. If I were to teach the Dhamma, others might not understand me, which would be wearying and troublesome for me. Then these verses, which were neither supernaturally inspired nor learned before in the past, occurred to me. I've struggled hard to realize this, enough with trying to explain it. This teaching is not easily understood by those mired in greed and hate. Those besotted by greed can't see what's subtle, going against the stream, deep, hard to see, and very fine, for they're shrouded in a mass of darkness. Tamo kandhena avuta, shrouded in a mass of darkness. Yeah? I don't know. I feel like if the Buddha were to say that today, people would say, "Come on, look on the bright side. You know, you're so negative." Bit of positive thinking, but anyway, that's what Brahma comes and gives him. Okay, so just to review this passage. So again, this is a very beautiful and very powerful passage with a huge implications for the future of Buddhism. I mean, it's so interesting. Like when we read these texts 2,500 years later, yeah, you can actually see that almost every line, every phrase, every paragraph has echoed down through the Buddhist tradition. Even if we haven't read the suttas, then the implications are still there. For that one about dependent origination, most Buddhists will have heard of dependent origination, and what do they know of it? Most Buddhists would know, it's hard and complicated and really hard to understand, and that's mostly what we know about it. So, people like attachment. They love it and enjoy it. Alaya Rama ko panayang paja, alaya rata, alaya samudita. It's hard to see these subtle things. So in this phrase, I won't go into it too much, but we have the phrase specific conditionality, dependent origination. So that's idapachayata, paticca samuppada. Specific conditionality, the sense of that, what that means is that this conditions that. So the point being that when the Buddha was teaching conditionality, he was teaching about specific things. He wasn't just teaching about conditionality generally speaking. He didn't just say things arise because of causes or things are interdependent. He said this thing conditions that thing. And the letting go of all attachments. Nibbana, sabba sankhara samato, sabbupadi parinisago, tanhakhayo virago nirodho nibbana. Then Brahma Sahampati, knowing what I was thinking, thought, oh my goodness, the world will be lost, the world will perish. For the mind of the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha inclines to remaining passive, not to teaching the Dhamma. Then, as easily as a strong person would extend or contract their arm, he vanished from the Brahma realm and reappeared in front of the Buddha. He arranged his robe over one shoulder, raised his joined palms towards the Buddha and said, Sir, let the Blessed One teach the Dhamma. Let the Holy One teach the Dhamma. There are beings with little dust in their eyes. They're in decline because they haven't heard the teaching. There will be those who understand the teaching. Bhavisanti dhammasa anyataro. There are beings with little dust in their eyes. Apa arajaka jatika. And he went on to say, among the Magadhans there appeared in the past an impure teaching thought up by those still stained. Fling open the door to the deathless. Aparupetang amatasadwarang. Let them hear the teaching the Immaculate One discovered. Standing high on a rocky mountain, you can see the people all around. In just the same way, all-seer, wise one, having ascended the temple of truth, rid of sorrow, look upon the people, swamped with sorrow, oppressed by rebirth and old age. Rise, hero, victor in battle, leader of the caravan, wander the world without obligation. Let the Blessed One teach the Dhamma. There will be those who understand. Hard to say no to an invitation like that, right? Then understanding Brahma's invitation, I surveyed the world with the eye of a Buddha because of my compassion for sentient beings. I saw sentient beings with little dust in their eyes, and some with much dust in their eyes, with keen faculties and with weak faculties, with good qualities and with bad qualities, easy to teach and hard to teach. And some of them lived, seeing the danger in the fault to do with the next world, while others did not. It's like a pool with blue water lilies or pink or white lotuses. Some of them sprout and grow in the water without rising above it, thriving underwater. Some of them sprout and grow in the water, reaching the water's surface, and some of them sprout and grow in the water, but rise up above the water and with no water clinging to them. In the same way, I saw sentient beings with little dust in their eyes, and some with much dust in their eyes. So just to note here the use of the word indriya in this context. Yeah? So we talked a bit about indriya yesterday. And so what indriya means in this case, it almost means something like spiritual potential. Yeah? Weak faculties and strong faculties, some with weak spiritual potential and some with strong spiritual potential. I'd also just like to make a brief note on the translation here. So notice that I said blue water lilies or pink or white lotuses, and I'm very proud of the fact that I am I believe the first translator who is pedantic enough to distinguish between a water lily and a lotus in this translation. Everybody else says blue lotuses, but in fact the blue ones are water lilies. So I just thought I'd just like to share that with you. Nobody else thought that that was worth making that distinction, but I did. So there you go. Then I replied in verse to Brahma Sahampati, flung open are the doors to the deathless, aparuta tesang amatasa dwara. Let those with ears to hear commit to faith. Thinking it would be troublesome, Brahma, I did not teach the sophisticated, sublime Dhamma among humans. Yeah. The second line of this verse is a difficult one, a tricky line to translate, and translators have approached it in a number of different ways. Yes, otavanto pamunchantu sadhang. So that let those with ears to hear, pamunchantu sadhang, release their faith. Pamunchati usually means to release or let go. So to release their faith sounds odd, doesn't it? Right? Some people say, oh, it means let go of your faith in like other religions. Okay, it's a bit odd. It's just a kind of an odd phrase. I think that this is a variant of another phrase in Pali. The same root has the word adhimuchati, and adhimuchati means to commit, and is a synonym for faith or certainty. Elsewhere in the suttas, you have sadhadimutta, one who is committed to faith or dedicated to faith. And so I think that this is just a poetic variation on that same phrase, and actually pumunchantu and sadhang have the same meaning. So that's why I think it means let those with ears to hear commit to faith. All right. Then Brahma Sahampati, knowing that his request for me to teach the Dhamma had been granted, bowed and respectfully circled me, keeping me on his right before vanishing right there. Then I thought, who should I teach first of all? Who will quickly understand this teaching? Then it occurred to me that Alara Kalama is astute, competent, clever, and has long had little dust in his eyes. Why don't I teach him first of all? He'll quickly understand the teaching. But a deity came to me and said, Sir, Alara Kalama passed away 7 days ago, and knowledge and vision arose in me. Alara Kalama passed away 7 days ago. So when he uses that idiom, knowledge and vision arose in me, that means that he used his psychic powers and could tell the same thing. Then he thought, that's a great loss for Alara Kalama. If he had heard the teaching, he would have understood it quickly. And the same thing happened with Uddaka Ramaputta, that he had also died recently, and the Buddha said it was a great loss. Then it occurred to me, the group of 5 mendicants were very helpful to me. They looked after me during my time of resolute striving. Why don't I teach them first of all? Interesting the different phrasing that he uses here when he's speaking of Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. Remember, these were the Upanishadic Brahman rishis who were practicing advanced stages of jhana. And he said they have long had little dust in their eyes and they will quickly understand the teaching. Whereas the 5 ascetics, who are the Jains practicing self-mortification, he says they were very helpful to me. Yeah? And I think there's a kind of a message there. But anyway, out of his gratitude, he wants to go and see them. And remember that they had left him, right, already. Right? So the Buddha didn't hold any grudge to them, even though they'd abandoned him, right? So, okay, they're gone, yeah, not attached. Why don't I teach them? Still grateful. Where are they staying now? Then he saw they're staying in the deer park in Isipatana, so he stayed at Uruvela as long as he wished, and then he set out for Benares. While I was travelling along the road between Gaya and Bodh Gaya, the Ajivika ascetic, Upaka, saw me and said, "Reverend, your faculties are so very clear, and your complexion is pure and bright. In whose name have you gone forth, Reverend? Who is your teacher? Whose teaching do you believe in?" I replied to Upaka in verse, "I am the champion, the knower of all, unsullied in the midst of all things. I've given up all, freed through the ending of craving, since I know for myself whose follower should I be. Sayang abhinyaya kamuddiseyang. I have no teacher, name acharyo atti. There is no one like me, sariso me navijati. In the world with its gods, I have no counterpart, nati me patipuggalo. For in this world, I am the perfected one. I am the supreme teacher. I alone am fully awakened, cooled, extinguished. Siddhi buddhosmi nibbutto. I am going to the city of Kasi to roll forth the wheel of Dhamma. In this world that is so blind, I'll beat the deathless drum. And Upaka replied, "According to what you claim, Reverend, you ought to be the infinite victor, Ananta Jina." Yeah? So remember that the Ajivikas were very closely related to the Jains, and in fact the founders were previously colleagues. So even though he's a Ajivika, he's still using this word, the Jina, yeah, to describe. So this must be one of their words for their supreme teacher, the infinite victor, Ananta Jino. The Buddha replied, "The victors are those who, like me, have reached the ending of defilements. I have conquered bad qualities, Upaka. That's why I'm a victor." Yeah. So this is probably the first example of how the Buddha would adopt the terminology and phrases of the other religions around and then give it its own meaning. Yeah? Jita me papaka dhamma. I've conquered bad qualities. When I had spoken, Upaka said, "If you say so, Reverend." Shaking his head, he took a wrong turn and left. Hupeya pavusoti, hupeya pavuso. If you say so. Sisang okampema. Umagang, a wrong turn. So poor old Upaka, so close, so very close, which, by the way, is what Upaka means. The word Upaka means nearly there. Almost, yeah? Now, so this whole episode, again, every one of these details is so rich and there's so much meaning in them, yeah? First of all, you can just see how, again, how ordinary what the Buddha was doing. I'll stay at Bodh Gaya for a while and do my meditation, then when I feel like it, I'll go down to Benares. He's not particularly hurried, walking along the road to Benares, no worries, yeah? Encounters another ascetic, is impressed. Oh, this guy looks like he's got something going, right? And asks him about it. And the power of the Buddha's verses, right? When he speaks with this authority, and he just has this self-confidence. And for any of us to say, "I am the champion, the knower of all, unsullied," I mean, okay. And if somebody says that to you, you're going to go, "All right, yeah, okay." And obviously that's what Upaka thought, right? And you must be, there in the world today, there are still lots of people who say these kinds of things, right? I mean, there's plenty of people who have their arahant status on Facebook and this kind of thing. And, I react like Upaka did. Yeah, okay, may it be so. And look, maybe I'll be like Upaka too. Maybe I'll miss the one time when it turns out to be right. Who knows? But there's something about that kind of authority, especially that when he says, "I have no teacher." Yeah, and this is a very kind of almost startling thing, when you have a culture which is so strongly driven by tradition, by the lineages of teachers and so on. And he says, no, actually, I don't belong to any lineage of teacher. I'm standing on my own two legs. And this is a very kind of powerful statement he's making here. To roll forth the wheel of the Dhamma. In this world that is so blind, I'll beat the deathless drum. Very powerful. Okay, the other thing that I love about this teaching is that it shows that the first time that the Buddha taught, that it didn't work. It gives me a lot of reassurance as a Dhamma teacher, because if I say something and if people don't get it or they don't not persuaded, it's okay. The Buddha didn't succeed every time either. Yeah. So usually in these things there's a history to them, and usually like in the commentaries and so on, you can find the history of Upaka and what he did before then and what he did afterwards and so on. But I think in the suttas themselves, that's the last we hear of Upaka. I think so. Right, so question is, what are the commentaries based on? Let me just do this. So the commentaries are... Okay, so this is the VRI CSCD site, which is a very kind of bare bones and ancient site. It's been going since the 90s with only a few changes, but it has the Pali, the commentaries and the sub-commentary and other literature as well. So if you're looking for something that isn't in the suttas, then this is usually the go-to place. So you can see here, Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, Abhidhamma Pitaka. So this is the Pitakas. And for the commentaries, then you have a commentary for each one of those. And within the commentary, again, if you look in the sutta commentaries, one for the Digha, Majjhima, and so on. And we can even look for a commentary for what we're looking at now. This is which chapter are we in? It's the Simile Upama Wagga. Right. So here is the commentary. There we go. So here's the commentary for that same sutta we're looking at now. And so that's what the commentary is. I won't go through it all. But so the commentary is a record which was made of the teachings and traditions that were passed down through the lineages of teachers, right? Now the origins of the commentaries would have been in the discussions and conversations that were had in the Buddha's day, right? So the Buddha would give a teaching, the Buddha would go away, the monks would say, what was that about? Somebody would say, I think it means this. Somebody else would say, I think it means that. Somebody else would say, I have no idea what was going on, and so on, yeah? And this is literally, the word that we translate as commentary literally means atthakatha, the discussion of the meaning. It's a literal happening. And so that is where the commentary begins. And so over time, the teachers would start to formulate these things and start to formulate specific explanations of the doctrines and so on. People would tell stories about them, right? Natural, right? So somebody might ask, what happened to Upaka? Right? It's not in the discourse itself, right? But somebody say, well, I heard that he actually went off to this Ajivika monastery and this happened and that happened, you know? And so these things then start to become part of the tradition. So this is the origins of it. And then, of course, it grows and develops over time. So it grew through that time in India until Reverend Mahinda brought the Tipitaka to Sri Lanka. And from that time, we're not really sure. The commentaries would have been brought to Sri Lanka in some form at that time, but we're not really sure exactly what the content of it was then. And then, of course, more is added to it over time since then. The commentaries themselves were mostly finalized about 100 CE, so about 500 years after the Buddha. Most of the content of the commentaries was finalized, and they then kind of remained fairly static for a few hundred years until the time of Buddhaghosa in about 400 and something CE, and Buddhaghosa then translated and compiled and edited them. But the content of the commentaries actually is from a few hundred years before that. And the reason we know that is because of the research of monks like Venerable Nyanamoli and others, and they looked at the names. So the commentaries will frequently cite the opinions of different teachers, and they'll say this teacher recommends this and this teacher recommends that, and sometimes those teachers are also mentioned in the Mahavamsa. Right? So we know actually when, and Mahavamsa is a very reliable historical document from the time of Duttagamadu onwards, right? So it gives all of the kings, the reigns, the years, and all of those kinds of things, and all of that information is actually very historically accurate. So we know that if a certain monk lived in the reign of a certain king, then we can date that monk to that time with a fair degree of accuracy. So this is why we can say that the actual content of the commentaries was mostly closed after being in Sri Lanka maybe a couple of hundred years, and then you don't have much additions to it, and then you have Buddhaghosa who edited and compiled it. Yeah, so this is where it comes from. So that we know that there's definitely things in the commentary that refer to facts from India that can be confirmed from archaeology. Right? So we know that there are some things that are confirmed. Right? Obviously, a lot of things were added in Sri Lanka, right? And you can't just take everything in the commentary as being, historically necessarily true. But some of them certainly are. Yeah. I mean, just one example is the commentary tells the story of, in the time of King Ashoka, or a little bit afterwards, of a group of monks who were helped to spread the Dhamma to different parts of India, and the same names of those same monks have been discovered in the reliquaries at Sanchi. Right? So you find the names listed in the story in the Vinaya commentary, and then actually dig up from the stupa in Sanchi, thousands of miles away, and it has the names of the same monks there. Yeah? So this is how we can confirm, in some cases, that there is a historical basis. All right. Okay. So this is the commentaries. Now, moving along. We went back. So Upaka, poor old Upaka. So close, yet so far. Travelling stage by stage, I arrived at Benares and went to see the group of 5 mendicants in the deer park at Isipatana. The group of 5 mendicants saw me coming off in the distance and stopped each other, saying, "Here comes ascetic Gautama. He's so indulgent. He's strayed from the struggle and returned to indulgence. We shouldn't bow to him, or rise for him, or receive his bowl and robe. But we can set out a seat. He can sit if he likes." Yet as I drew closer, can you imagine doing that to the Buddha, right? Oh no, I'm not going to give him a drink of water. No, I wouldn't do that for him. No. Anyway, as I grew closer, the group of 5 mendicants were unable to stop themselves as they had agreed. Some came out to greet me and receive my bowl and robe. Some spread out a seat, while others set out water for washing my feet. But still, they addressed me by name and as reverend as avuso. So I said to them, so the word avuso is a somewhat familiar term. Still respectful, but somewhat familiar. So I said to them, "Mendicants, don't address me by name and as reverend. The realized one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha. Listen up, mendicants. I have achieved the deathless. I shall instruct you. I shall teach you the Dhamma. By practicing as instructed, you will soon realize the supreme end of the spiritual path in this very life. You will live having achieved with your own insight the goal for which gentlemen rightly go forth from the lay life to homelessness. But they said to me, Reverend Gautama, one more point on Pali I'll just take here. I'm translating this word gentleman, which is the Pali is kulaputta, yasataya kulaputta. And it's a bit of a tricky one to translate into English because the sort of cultural connotations are very different. And sometimes with these words, it's the sort of cultural specifics are quite, obviously it's a very different society. Literally, kulaputta means the son of sons of families, right? And you also have kuladita as the daughters of families. But kulaputta means somewhat a bit more than that because it usually means the sons of good families, right? So it means people who've gone forth or come from a good family in the society. Bhikkhu Bodhi translates kulaputta as clansman, which I think is a little bit unfortunate because if you Google images for clansmen, you either get Scotsmen in kilts or guys in white robes with pointy hats burning crosses, neither of which are particularly apt for what is being meant here. So I've ended up translating as gentleman, which is a little bit kind of archaic, but it conveys that kind of sense that these, it's a kind of respectful term, that these are kind of good people. They said to me, Reverend Gautama, again, somewhat, they're still using the familiar term, even though he said not to. Even by that conduct, that practice, that grueling work, you did not achieve any superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones. How could you have achieved such a state now that you've become indulgent, strayed from the struggle, and returned to diligence? So this phrase, the superhuman distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones, is a technical term. Here it's being used by the Jains, but in the Buddhist sense, this is defined in the Vinaya, and it means essentially the jhanas, the various psychic powers, and the states of enlightenment. So I said to them, the realized one has not become indulgent, strayed from the struggle and returned to indulgence. The realized one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha. Listen up, mendicants, I have achieved the deathless. I shall instruct you. I will teach you the Dhamma. By practicing as instructed, you will soon realize the supreme end of the spiritual path in this very life. And so they kept on denying him, and he kept on asserting it, and he said on the third time, mendicants, have you ever known me to speak like this before? No, sir, we have not. I have achieved the deathless. I will instruct you. Eventually I was able to persuade the group of 5 mendicants. Then I sometimes advised 2 mendicants while the other 3 went for alms. Then those 3 would feed all 6 of us with what they brought back. Sometimes I advised 3 mendicants while the other 2 went for alms. Then those 2 would feed all 6 of us with what they brought back. So of course the teaching that he gave there, the first teaching was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and then followed by the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. Both of which, and in the Vinaya, the Vinaya Khandikas, first chapter of the Khandikas, tells this story also and introduces those suttas in that place. So also interesting about how they're kind of practicing, right? So sometimes, just a couple would go on alms round, get some food and bring it back, and then they would share the food with all of them. They're so dedicated to meditation, right, that they would go and then come back, and they're still teaching. And so, of course, this again is giving us a hint that, we have the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta from these period, both of which, of course, very important suttas, but also fairly short suttas, right? I mean, you can teach those 2 suttas in half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, yeah? But this sounds like they were going for days, right? So obviously there was more, yeah? And so, we don't know what that was. Yeah. So we know that, of course we don't think that the suttas record everything that the Buddha taught, but we believe that at least the essential parts are there. Yeah? As the group of 5 mendicants were being advised and instructed by me like this, being themselves liable to be reborn, understanding the drawbacks in being liable to be reborn, They sought the unborn supreme sanctuary extinguishment, and they found it. Being themselves liable to grow old, fall sick, die, sorrow, and become corrupted, understanding the drawbacks in these things, they sought the unaging, unailing, undying, sorrowless, uncorrupted supreme sanctuary extinguishment, and they found it. Knowledge and vision arose in them. Our freedom is unshakable. This is our last birth. Now there are no more future lives. Akupa no vimutti. Ayamanti nathidani punabhavoti. So at this point, the Buddha has now led his first disciples to that same realization that he came to. And so one of the things we find all the way through the suttas is that when the Buddha spoke of his enlightenment, he did exactly the same way when he's talking about the enlightenment of his disciples. No different, like literally exactly the same words. So he was not sort of, he was the senior in terms of being the first to arrive and to discover the Dhamma, but in terms of the freedom, they were the same. So this is the main part of the biographical part of the sutta. There's also like an appendix here, which I'll just go over briefly, which is about the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation, the 5 karma guna. Sights known by the eye that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. Sounds known by the ear, smells known by the nose, tastes known by the tongue, touches known by the body, that are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. There are ascetics and Brahmins who enjoy these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation, tied, infatuated, attached, blind to the drawbacks and not understanding the escape. You should understand that they have met with calamity and disaster and are vulnerable to the wicked one. Papimato, being Mara, of course. Suppose a deer in the wilderness was lying caught on a pile of snares. You know that it has met with calamity and disaster and is vulnerable to the hunter. And when the hunter comes, it cannot flee where it wants. In the same way, there are ascetics and Brahmins who enjoy these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation, and they are vulnerable to the wicked one. There are ascetics and Brahmins who enjoy these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation without being tired, infatuated, or attached, seeing the drawbacks and understanding the escape. You should understand that they have not met with calamity and disaster and are not vulnerable to the wicked one. Suppose a deer in the wilderness was lying on a pile of snares without being caught. You'd know that it hasn't met with calamity and disaster and isn't vulnerable to the hunter. And when the hunter comes, it can flee wherever it wants. And the same way, there are ascetics who enjoy these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation, but without being attached to them. Suppose there was a wild deer wandering in the forest that walked, stood, sat, and laid down in confidence. Why is that? Because it's out of the hunter's range. In the same way, a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption. This is a mendicant who has blinded Mara, put out his eyes without a trace, and gone where the wicked one cannot see. And so on through the different jhanas. I'll talk more about jhanas later, so I won't go into that here. And through the formless attainments, and up to neither perception nor non-perception. And then now, finally, they've crossed over clinging to the world, and they walk, stand, sit, and lie down in confidence. Why is that? Because they're out of the wicked one's range. That is what the Buddha has said. Satisfied, the mendicants were happy with what the Buddha said. So I find it's interesting that sutta has those 2 parts, right? The 2 titles. The Pasarasi is the obviously the final stage of the sutta, but the two parts are not closely linked together. I mean, obviously there's a thematic connection there, but it's interesting that that's appended to that sutta there. Okay. Any questions? We're going to break for morning tea in a minute, where we will attempt to enjoy our nice cup of tea without being infatuated and attached to it. Can we do that? Yeah? We can try. Okay, so sorry, yes, Nicole.
It was interesting to me the difference between the Buddhist description of enlightenment, particularly yesterday, about just sitting under a tree doing silent
Right?
meditation, versus, and my question is this part of the tradition, or maybe is it in the sutta somewhere, versus this other image of him sitting under a tree one day, sometimes 3 days, and sometimes say 40 days, battling with Mara,
Uh-huh.
and then putting his hand on earth and saying, I'm worthy.
All right, yeah, the Bhumi Sparsha. Yeah, Bhumi.
Like this one, this day suttas and yesterday's sutta is kind of like, just sit under a tree.
Right? Yeah. I mean, look, I'm sure that there was something more to it, right? So like I said, there is these different takes on that same event, so each one giving a bit of a different perspective. But yeah, that very kind of elaborate sort of attack by Mara's army and invoking the earth goddess to witness, yeah, this is part of the later legends. But of course, it's a fantastic image, right? The Buddha there with Mara's army attacking him, and it's an amazing image. Actually, in the suttas, there is one sutta that talks about the Mara's army attacking the Buddha, but Mara's army in that context is purely psychological. Your first army is sloth, and then there's anger, and then there's restlessness. I can't remember what all the 10 armies of Mara are. But but of course, a lot of that just comes because of painting, actually. Right? I mean, how do you depict enlightenment? Yeah? You can't depict a psychological state. You can't draw it. And so when they moved to having a lot of the sculptures and the paintings, they had to find a way to represent these things visually. And that's where these things come from. Yeah. Nilushi. Okay. So this is what you're getting, like a glimmer of hope here, are you? Well, one thing I should mention here, and before you go on, just let me mention just one thing, and that is the word I've translated as enjoy here. It's a bit dubious, and maybe I should change it, but the word is bhunjati, which has really two senses in Pali. One is to enjoy something, and the other is to use something. Yeah? We do it a bit similar in English as well. Say, I enjoyed a meal, meaning I had a meal, So it's that sense of enjoy. But anyway, go on.
So it's like, okay, so you have your cup of tea,
Yes.
whatever you feel is whatever you feel in relation to it.
Right.
How do you, when's the distinction on the line before it becomes attachment? Is that when you have another cup of tea?
Right.
You'll kill the cup, still have a cup of tea?
Well, that would definitely be a red flag, yes.
Very subtle.
Giovanni's feeling a bit more uncomfortable as this proceeds.
It is very subtle to understand the distinction between experiencing and enjoying something.
Sure, yes. Right, but you've already given that indication there, and when you're asking, like, if you have the cup of tea, that's nice, and move on. It's not such a big deal, yeah. But is your mind tied to it? What happens if you don't get it? Yeah. What happens if what happens if you're at a restaurant and you order a meal and then it comes out and it's not good? Right? Do you get upset? Yeah. Right? So there you go. Yeah. Do you say, oh, okay, that's all right. Yeah, people in the restaurant are working hard. They can't always do a good job. That's all right. Yeah. And so there are degrees in these things. So this again is part of the middle way. Right? So again, the Buddha never said you can't have a nice meal. He never said you can't enjoy a cup of tea. Well, they didn't have tea, so he couldn't have said that. But just moderation, yeah. And that's the point of that simile, right? And as bhikkhus, we still go to a nice place like that. We still see these nice things. We still eat the nice food and so on. And so enjoy pleasures in a kind of moderate way, not in an extreme way, but you do it mindfully. You're like, oh, okay, that's all. Yeah. 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 Ling and Tom. Oh, Ling and Tom. It's Ling's hand behind Tom's head. Okay. Who prior to the Buddha realized cessation? Well, if it's cessation as the Buddha taught, then no one except for the previous Buddhas.
So I'm interested here about Brahmins who enjoy the life kind of sensual stimulation, seeing the drawbacks and understanding this.
Right. So, all right, so... Right, yeah, so what you mean is because it's referring to ascetics and Brahmins, so it's a general thing rather than just sort of Buddhists, like ascetic and Brahmins can be anyone, right? Yeah, oh no, good point, yeah. Let me just see. Okay, so if you look at the narrative flow, right? So it's talking about that being caught in the snare of sensual pleasures, yeah? And then it goes on to teach the jhanas. So the jhanas is the escape from that, yeah? So when Mendicant has blinded Mara, put out his eyes without a trace and gone where the wicked one cannot see. So basically any ascetics and Brahmins who are practicing jhanas. Yeah. No, the difference between the Buddha that he got enlightened. Yes. Yeah. This being the case with the Buddha's former teachers. Yeah. Yeah. So the point there being that, like, if you can practice the jhanas, then in that state of jhana, then you're protected and you're free of any hindrances. But also, like, if you even if you're practicing jhanas even outside of that jhanic experience, it's still actually a very powerful experience, and so it's still the hindrances are very get suppressed for a long time afterwards. And if you're practicing jhanas regularly, then you can actually keep the hindrances completely suppressed for a long time, yeah, many years. Yeah? But the potential is still there. Yeah. In fact, and I'll finish it on this story, but that's in fact the story of the naming of the Isipatana. If you know that story. So the Isipatana, where the Buddha taught the first sermon, literally means the sage's drop-in place. And that's what it meant, actually, right? It was just a places where the rishis would drop by. But according to the story, the rishis who had developed jhanas and they had the psychic power to be able to fly through the air. And so they were flying through the air above the Isipatana, and there in the river, they saw all these young women bathing naked in the river. Immediately their psychic powers went away. And they dropped right out of the sky. Right? Yeah. So this is the Isipatana, the sages drop. There's another story about that where there was a rishi before. This was in one of the Jataka stories. So one of the rishis who used to live in the Himalayas. And he came down to, he was practicing jhanas and so on, and he came down to the city to go for alms, and the king was very impressed by him. So the king gave him a kuti in the royal palace, right? Built him a kuti, and he was like, he said, just meditate there, and I will look after you. And then that rishi would like fly with his psychic powers up to the roof of the palace, and then the king would offer him alms in the morning. And so then he would take his alms and then he would fly back down to his hut. So that was very impressive, and everyone was like, very good. So one day the king was away and he flew up to the roof of the palace, but the queen got up late that morning, and she got up and she was naked when she got up, and she's like, oh, just have to cover myself. And the monk saw what he shouldn't have seen. And he's like, oh, well, I think I'll take the stairs today. So... This is that power of sense restraint, yes, or lack thereof. Yes.
You actually say the state of non-return. Is it the same thing
It sounds very similar, doesn't it? Yeah, because they have in Pali, they have what they call the Suddhavasa, which are the deities who become non-returners and they go and live in the pure abodes. And I think I'm not that familiar with that Mahayana teaching, so I can't say exactly, but it certainly sounds like it's a similar idea. Yeah.
Is the place of no return, is it different to become an arahant? Because if he says I'm practiced to become an arahant, I still have an attachment or an intention to do it. Whereas, the place of no return, does that mean that's it?
No, it's just like the Suddha, in the suttas, the Suddhavasa are basically stepping grounds or just sort of pausing grounds along the way to arahantship. So someone who's become a non-returner is almost completely let go of all of their defilements, and so they get reborn in this very pure place, and they just live out their last few eons, and then poof, they're gone. Now, for the next session, we're going to be looking at Majjhima Nikaya number 141, the Sattavibhanga Sutta, which is the analysis of the truths. And so this discourse gives an overview and a detailed analysis of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. So these are the most fundamental teachings of Buddhism. So everything is going to draw from that. So the discourse starts with the Buddha in the deer park at Isipatana. And so this was a time when he had revisited the deer park at some later time in his career. And then he is referring back to the first time he was there when he taught the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Near Benares, in the deer park at Isipatana, the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha, rolled forth the supreme wheel of Dhamma. And that wheel cannot be rolled back by any ascetic or Brahman or God or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world. And that is the teaching, advocating, establishing, clarifying, analyzing, and revealing of the Four Noble Truths. What for? The Noble Truths of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Buddha goes on to say, you should cultivate friendship with Sariputta and Moggallana. You should associate with Sariputta and Moggallana. They're astute and they support their spiritual companions. Sariputta is just like the mother who gives birth, while Moggallana is like the one who raises the child. Sariputta guides people to the fruit of stream entry, Moggallana to the highest goal. Sariputta is able to explain, teach, assert, establish, clarify, analyze, and reveal the Four Noble Truths in detail. That is what the Buddha said when he had spoken. The Holy One got up from his seat and entered his dwelling. Soon after the Buddha left, Venerable Sariputta said to the mendicants, "Reverence, mendicants." "Reverend," they replied, and Sariputta said this. And so then Sariputta is the speaker of the remainder of the discourse. So we can see here that the Buddha is authorizing Sariputta and Moggallana, and particularly authorizing Sariputta in the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. It's an interesting detail here that Sariputta is the one who leads people to stream entry, and then Moggallana guides them to the higher goal. Interesting kind of detail, right? They had different kind of focuses. But it's also noteworthy that in teaching the Four Noble Truths, okay, if you recall, I said, I think it was yesterday, I pointed out that in the Theravada, when it talks about enlightenment, it has the formula for the Four Noble Truths, idang dukkhang, and then it repeats it first of all with this is suffering, the origin of suffering, the end of suffering, and then with this is defilements. This is the origin of defilements, the end of defilements, and so on. And I said that the first formula, idang dukkhang, talking about suffering, commonly refers to stream entry. And ime asava, and the ending of the asavas always refers to arahantship. So when you find both of those two things together, then the first part is talking about stream entry, the second part is talking about arahantship. And that association of stream entry with the vision of the Four Noble Truths we find is very strong throughout the suttas. And indeed, it's implied here, right? The Buddha has just said people lead, Sariputta leads people to stream entry, and he teaches the Four Noble Truths. Here they are. This is how he's doing it. This is how he's teaching people to stream entry. So this teaching of the Four Noble Truths in terms of the vision of the Four Noble Truths, that the direct insight to it, is closely associated with stream entry. Okay. Sariputta then goes on, repeats the Buddha's introduction, and then goes on to analyze each of these Noble Truths in detail. And so we will note these. Okay, so one of the ways that the suttas work is that they tend to use a lot of very highly specialized and precise terminology, right? And that terminology is not defined every time it's used, right? It's defined in one place and then it's used elsewhere. If you're familiar with like a legal document, for example, same thing, right? They begin the legal document, they'll define all the terms, and then they assume that's what you use afterwards, so you don't have to define it every time. So in the suttas, we find the same thing, and usually, or most commonly, these are the Vibhanga suttas. Okay, so when we see something which is called a Vibhanga sutta, then, so you have like the Salayatana Vibhanga sutta, or the Paticcasamuppada Vibhanga sutta, or the Indriya Vibhanga sutta, and so on. Usually it's in those Vibhanga suttas that it gives the overall definitions of the main terms, which are then to be understood everywhere else. Okay, so they're like a key to understanding the Dhamma. Okay, so down here, the noble truth of suffering. Rebirth is suffering. Old age is suffering. Death is suffering. He's not pulling any punches here. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress are suffering. Not getting what you wish for is suffering. In brief, the 5 grasping aggregates are suffering. So here, Sariputta is repeating the teaching that the Buddha gave in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and he then proceeds to elaborate further. But what is rebirth? Right? This is very characteristic of Sariputta's teaching style. Yeah? He keeps on drawing out, going into more and more and more detail. What is rebirth? The rebirth, inception, conception, reincarnation, manifestation of the aggregates and acquisition of the sense fields of the various sentient beings in the various orders of sentient beings. This is called rebirth. Okay, so again, it's a very explicit, straightforward definition here. You could hardly ask for anything more explicit and straightforward, which doesn't stop many teachers today saying, no, rebirth is just psychological. It's rebirth of a sense of self. No, it's not. It's rebirthing and getting born again. Normally when people translate jati, they translate it as birth, but actually when jati is used in the suttas, it invariably means rebirth, in the sense that we know. There's no kind of concept, and even birth is not really right, because birth is actually vijati, which is the emergence from the womb. So jati, I think, is more correctly translated as rebirth. What is old age? Jara. The old age, decrepitude, broken teeth. I've got lots of broken teeth. Grey hair, wrinkly skin, diminished vitality. Oh, I don't have that anymore because I just had some coffee. And failing faculties of the various sentient beings in the various orders of sentient beings. This is called old age. And once again, one could hardly ask for a more explicit physical definition of old age. What is death? The passing away, perishing, disintegration, demise, mortality, death, decease, breaking up of the aggregates, laying to rest of the corpse, and cutting off of the life faculty of the various sentient beings in the various orders of sentient beings. Of course, many synonyms for the same word here. But this also is useful because this is showing us, like when we look through the suttas, we find these terms all the time, right? Words like chuti, or bhedo, and so on. And these are commonly found terms in the suttas, and so we know, oh, actually it's just referring to the same thing. Kalankirya. What is sorrow? The sorrowing state of sorrow, inner deep sorrow in someone who has undergone misfortune, who has experienced suffering. Lamentation, the wail, lament, wailing, lamenting state of wailing and lamentation in someone who has undergone misfortune and experienced suffering. What is pain? So dukkha. So we have the compound here, dukkha, domanassa. Dukkha, physical pain, physical displeasure, the painful, unpleasant feeling born of physical contacts. What is sadness? Domanassa, mental pain, mental displeasure, the painful, unpleasant feeling born from mind contact. So the word dukkha is used in a variety of ways, but in this context, when you find dukkha and domanassa together, dukkha means physical pain and domanassa means mental pain. There's distress, state of stress and distress in someone who has undergone misfortune, who's experienced suffering. This is called distress. So what is not getting what you wish for is suffering. Sentient beings who are liable to be reborn, such a wish arises. Oh, if only we were not liable to be reborn. If only birth would not come to us. But you can't get that by wishing. That's not getting what you wish for is suffering. So if you're not wanting to get old or fall ill or die or experience sorrow and lamentation, and then you wish, oh, if only I couldn't experience sorrow, oh. But you can't get that by wishing. This is not getting what you wish for is suffering. And what is, in brief, the 5 grasping aggregates of suffering? These are the grasping aggregates that consist of form, feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness. Okay, this is the noble truth of suffering. Before we move on, do we have any questions about the noble truth of suffering? Tom?
The bystanders.
Yes. Right? Okay, yeah, sure. As the choice of choices, right? One of the guiding principles in all my translations was to try to express things in a way that would sound like an actual human being was speaking them and sound like something that you would actually say in real language. So in the suttas, when they talk about this sankhara, you have a phrase, for example, punya abhisankarang abhisankaroti, which I think in Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation says something like, they form a meritorious volitional formation. Which I don't know about you, but it doesn't sound exactly like English. It's not wrong, but it's also not quite English, right? It's what they call Buddhist hybrid English. What that actually means is making good choices. That's how I translate it. Yeah? And the basic idea, the main point in sankhara there is that it's about the choices that you make about your volition or intention or will. Little curiosities about the English language is that when we talk about moral decisions, right, we usually use the word choice. It's idiomatic to use the word choice. It's not idiomatic to say he made bad volitions, right? I don't know why, but you don't. You can say you have bad intentions, okay, that works, yeah? But then the problem there is good intentions. Because when you say someone has good intentions, usually what you mean is that they're doing something bad. This is kind of a peculiarity of English, right? Will is the same. So will, you can't also have plural, but you also can't say good wills. He had good wills, also doesn't work, right? So the problem is that when we talk about morality, if we talk about doing something good, we say, oh, they made good choices, yeah? Or they made bad choices, right? And if you ask something like, how did somebody end up, they came from a good family, how did they end up living in the gutter? oh, he made some bad choices. Yeah? So this is the normal idiom in English, is that we use the word choice with good and bad to create a sort of outcome. Yeah. So I was more focused on conveying the central meaning to somebody who's reading it, rather than requiring that you have to do a course in the Abhidhamma before you're going to make sense of the suttas. Yeah. Anne? Yes. Okay, so just your voice is quiet. I'll repeat for the camera. So Anne's asking, in dependent origination, she thinks of sankhara as meaning condition. So how does it mean the same thing as choice? Yes, so sankhara can have different meanings. And in some cases, yes, it means condition. So if we say sabbe sankhara anicca, all conditions are impermanent in that context, yeah? Or all conditioned phenomena. Yeah? Sometimes sankhara can also mean a cause. So sankhara is actually a synonym for paccaya or nidana or something like that. In dependent origination, though, as the second link of dependent origination, it also means choice, because it means those choices that we make that lead to getting reborn and to generating the consciousness, because so it's sankhara paccaya vijnanam, we generate that consciousness. Yeah? And when it's defined in dependent origination, then it's defined as making those good choices and bad choices. Yeah. That's right, yeah. Uh-huh. That's beforehand. The choices are beforehand. The choices are what led you to be in that state. Yeah? Yeah, that's right. Basically the same as karma. Yeah? Yeah. Does that make sense? All right. Ling.
So the karma or the consciousness actually travel to be in the brain. That is actually just called the egg consciousness.
The egg consciousness?
Yeah, number 8.
8. Egg consciousness. 8. All right. So the eighth consciousness that's a concept that's used in the Yogacara. So no, in the suttas you only have 6 consciousnesses. Actually, the 8th consciousness is just a kind of mind consciousness. So there. But in suttas it's just called vijnana, it's just called consciousness. The Buddha didn't give it any special name. Yeah.
So the vijnana is actually traveling.
The stream of vijnana, yeah. The stream, vijnana sota, yeah.
And then when the condition is actually right, it's actually 6. And
Yeah. Yep. Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes, Aya. Okay. Right. Okay, so in the, I'll just show on the screen for people. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, you have a whole chapter of more or less Vibhanga Suttas, right? Actually, not all of them called Vibhanga Suttas, so it begins with the Bhaddekaratta Sutta, which is not a Vibhanga Sutta, but then you have, well, it kind of is, but basically in that case you have a verse and then various explanations of the verse, right? So you have a few suttas with different explanations of that verse. Then you have the Chula Kamma Vibhanga Sutta and the Mahakamma Vibhanga Sutta analyzing Kamma. The 6 senses, Salayatana Vibhanga. Then Uddesa Vibhanga is a little bit different because these ones, Uddesa Vibhanga, Arana Vibhanga, these are not like Vibhangas of specific doctrines, but they're more just a passage and then an analysis. But then the Dhatu Vibhanga, Satcha Vibhanga, also taking like the four elements and then analysing that, or taking the truths and analysing that. I mean, in one sense, the analysis discourses have to be later than the thing they're analysing, right? Makes sense. But I don't think that as a whole they're a particularly late group of texts. A lot of these were taken up as the foundation for the Abhidhamma, especially the Abhidhamma Vibhanga, right? So the section on the Four Noble Truths in the Abhidhamma Vibhanga is largely based on the Sacha Vibhanga Sutta, yeah? So it became used that way. And there may be some features in there that are a bit developed later on, but generally speaking, I don't think so, yeah. But, you can see how there is that, even in this one, there is that kind of handing off, right? The Buddha's giving off to Sariputta. You can fill in all the details. I'll give you the outline. Yeah. Fun. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Right. But then that's not karma. I'm not quite sure I understand you correctly, but if I understand you correctly, you're saying that there are some thoughts that you have that you can't just help it, and it just sort of random thoughts and things that happen in your mind. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. That's right. So this is not sankhara in that sense. This is not creating karma. You're only creating karma when you make a moral choice. Because that's how it's defined in the suttas. I can look it up for you if you're still not. You sound like you're still not persuaded. So let me try to assuage your fears. I have to try to remember where this is. Is it here? So I'm just trying to recall. No. Over here. Right, so there it has the kaya sankhara, vaci sankhara, citta sankhara. So here's the definition of choices in dependent origination, right? This is in the Vibhanga Sutta for dependent origination. There are three kinds of choices by way of body, speech and mind: kaya sankhara, vaci sankhara, citta sankhara. So these are always, like the kaya sankhara, vaci sankhara, citta sankhara, are always kinds of like intentions or actions that you do, right? They're not just sort of random things, but they're about the intention that lies behind the actions or the deeds that you make. So this is one passage. So just the reason I'm hesitating is because there's a number of relevant passages, and I'm not sure that I can find all of the relevant passages. I'm not sure if I can find all the relevant passages off the top of my head. Let me see. Where are we now? Okay, so here's an example of what I was talking about. So we just saw the previous sutta in the Vibhanga Sutta. It talks about bodily, mental, and sankharas by way of body, speech, and mind. So here we have Samyutta Nikaya number 12.25, the Bhumija Sutta, and this is another discourse about dependent origination. Okay, so it's looking at dependent origination from another context. So skipping ahead to section 10, Ananda, as long as there's a body, the intention that gives rise to bodily action causes pleasure and pain to arise in oneself. Okay, kaya va hananda sati. As long as there is a body, kaya sanchetana hetu upajati ajhatang sukadikang. So here the kaya sanchetana is being used, which very explicitly means it must be the intention. As long as there's a voice, the intention that gives rise to verbal action, the intention that gives rise to mental action. Yeah? So these give rise to pleasure and pain, but these only occur when conditioned by ignorance, avidya pachaya. Okay? Again, we're in the context of dependent origination here. So this is talking about avidya pachaya sankhara, and then sankhara pachaya, these kinds of consciousness. Then it goes on, by oneself, one instigates the choice that gives rise to bodily and verbal and mental action conditions by which that pleasure and pain rise in oneself. Samang watang ananda kaya sankharang abhisankharoti yam pachaya satang upajati ajhatang sukhang. So again, talking about making that choice, kaya sankharang abhisankharoti, and then giving rise to pleasure and pain within yourself. So it's always moral choices that do this. Moral choices that give rise to pleasure and pain. Good choices give rise to happiness. Bad choices give rise to suffering. Yeah? And ignorance is included in all of these things. And once again, this is in the context of dependent origination. And so when ignorance fades away and ceases with nothing left over, there is no body, no voice, no mind, conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in oneself. There is no field, no scope, no ground, no basis conditioned by which pleasure and pain arise in oneself. Does that make it clear? So again, there's a number of different suttas there that talk about this. Yeah, and if you're interested, I'd recommend studying the Nidana Samyutta, which talks about dependent origination. And then there's a number of very interesting suttas that talk about that there. Okay? Okay, very good. Any other questions before we move on? All right? Good. Right. Oh, where are we? We're at suffering. All right. The brief, the 5 aggregates of suffering. Yes. Origin of suffering, the craving that leads to future rebirth, mixed up with relishing and greed. Looking for enjoyment in various different realms, that is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving to continue existence, and craving to end existence. All right? So, kama tanha, nice, enjoy, lovely. Yeah? Bhava tanha, I want to continue to enjoy, right? Bhava literally means existence, but what it actually means is craving to get reborn. I mean, in the most simple form, right? Most basic form, bhava tanha means I want to go to heaven. That's really what it means, actually. Yeah? I want to get born in a nice, pleasant place where I can be happy and enjoy myself. Yeah? But a bit more subtle, because not just sensual enjoyment, but also includes if I want to get reborn in a Brahma realm. Right? If I practice meditation, go into deep jhanas and samadhi, and then I think like Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta, right? You're going to get Yava Deva Akinchanya Yatanang Upapatya. Yeah? So to be reborn in that realm, this is bhava tanha. Yeah? Get reborn in those realms. Even that's very subtle. That's only a little bit. Yeah? Tiny little bit of attachment. Yeah? But still there's attachment. Yeah? And then the other one is the craving to end existence, vibhava tanha. And the craving to end existence is like the dark side of that, right? And so sometimes that's what we want. We're like, I don't want to have this anymore. We want to get rid of it. And craving to end existence, the Buddha said, can be very close to the Buddha's teachings. Yeah? Yeah? When you talk about extinguishment and nibbana, it's a subtle difference. But in craving to end existence, there is always a sense of self. right? There's still always attachment. I exist, and I want to make myself end existence, yeah? Whereas from the Buddha's point of view, there is suffering, and without the cause of that suffering will come to an end. Yeah? It's a subtle distinction, yeah? But a crucial one. We should expect that we're dealing with very subtle matters. They should be subtle distinctions. Yeah. So what is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering? It is the fading away and cessation of that very same craving, yo tasayeva tanhaya, with nothing left over, giving it away, letting it go, releasing it, and not adhering to it. This is called the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Yeah? Adhering. Oh, that's actually good. That's a word in English that has the da sound. We were talking about the other day. Adhere. Da. Yeah. Anyway, cessation of suffering. What is the noble truth of the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering? It is simply this noble eightfold path, that is right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right immersion. Samma ditti, samma sankappo, samma vacha, samma kammanto, samma ajivo, samma vayamo, samma sati, samma samadhi. Okay? So this is dukkha satcha, dukkha samudaya satcha, dukkha nirodha satcha, and dukkha nirodha gamani patipada satcha. So you should remember all of these things. I'm going to be testing them tomorrow. And you should know them in Pali and English, by the way. All right? So that's your homework for today. So what is right view? Knowing about suffering, the origin of suffering, cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. So again, Sariputta has reiterated one of the core teachings of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, where the Buddha teaches the Noble Eightfold Path, and then he's drawing it out in more detail. Right? So the Buddha only taught it in brief there, and Sariputta now spelling it out in detail. So right view, the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, is the noble origin of the Four Noble Truths. So these two things are recursive. The Four Noble Truths include the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path includes the Four Noble Truths. They are talking about the same thing from a different perspective. What is right thought? Samma sankappo. Thoughts of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. Okay, so sankappa we can translate as right thought or right intention. What is right speech? Refraining from lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and talking nonsense. Sampappalapa, veramani. So please, if you have any questions about these, please ask them as we go. Yeah. Yeah. Sankappa can be used in both of those senses, yeah? And sometimes you can translate it as thought, sometimes as intention, sometimes as both. Yeah, so it kind of straddles that divide. But it definitely has that kind of active sense that intention has. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So another possible translation of Samma Sankappa is right motivation. Yeah, could do. Yeah. I found when I was translating that most of the times when you translate Sankappa, motivation doesn't quite work. Motivation is like kind of what lies behind something, whereas the Sankappa is like the direction it's going to. Motivation is like where it's coming from. Sankappa is where it's going to. So it's not a bad translation. I've used it myself sometimes, but I felt that either thought or intention was a bit better. Yeah. Well, motivation lies behind it, right? It lies behind the effort, yeah? So it lies behind the Sankappa. Yeah. Yes.
I had some associations to it, pronunciation, absence of breathing, possibly, or absence
Yep.
of self. I just wondered if you could speak more to
Okay. Okay, so with right view, if you start with the start of the path, you have right view, and the right view gives you a perspective, right? It gives you a way of seeing, yeah? A way of understanding things. But we still need to live, right? And it's not enough to just walk around the world and say, oh yes, this is suffering. Oh yes, this is suffering. Oh yes, this is suffering. I mean, it's not wrong, but it's also not not enough, right? So samasankappa is like, in a way, that's setting you in motion. Yeah? This is like the direction that you take. Okay, we know that the world is suffering, then what do we do about it? Yeah? How do we actually direct our mind? So sankappa ensures that, so first of all, renunciation is based on letting go, goodwill, yeah, based on having that mind of metta, and harmlessness is not doing any harm to anyone. And so this is making sure that right from the start of the path that we are directing our mind in that right way. Yeah? So in a way, the right thought or the right intention leaves a lot of things very open. Yeah? You can still practice in many ways from that, yeah? many different ways of implementing those things. But it's shaping the way that you live. Yeah? Sammasankappa shapes the way that you live. Sammaditthi shapes the way you see things. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. I'll move ahead. And of course, sammasankappa's right thought or right intention is closely related to speech, because speech is the most direct. Think before you speak, or not, as the case may be. So right speech, refraining from lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, and talking nonsense. And of course, should know that here, this is defined in a negative way, refraining from speaking, but elsewhere, the Buddha defined speech also in a positive way. Right? So speaking words that are kind, that are easy to listen to, words that reconcile those who are divided, words that are meaningful, words that are spoken at the right time. Yeah? All of these things are qualities of right speech. So right speech is not just no speech. Yeah. Sometimes it's no speech. Okay. Right action, refraining from killing living creatures, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And once again, this is not just, here is phrased in a sense of refraining, but also has a positive sense. And in the suttas, the teaching on refraining from killing is described as living with a heart full of compassion for all sentient beings. So I'm skipping over these a little bit quickly, so I'm just leaving time for any questions as we go. Go on, please. Yes. What do you renounce? More importantly, she says. What do you renounce, and more importantly, what do you not renounce? Yes. Well, you renounce whatever's giving rise to suffering. Yeah? That's the most important thing. The Buddha never said, just give away everything all the time, right? The Buddha wasn't an extremist like that. You give away what you're ready to give away, but you look into your life and what's giving rise to suffering, right? I mean, if you're an alcoholic, alcohol's giving you suffering. Give that up, And so this is one of the things that you see a lot of the time in spiritual circles, and it's one of the manifestations of spiritual bypassing, is people give up the wrong thing. Yeah? Rather than giving up the thing that's actually causing suffering, they give up something that seems like it's giving something up, and they're actually not really looking at the right things. So consider, and then look at, well, also a bit like what we were talking about before, like what is it that makes you suffer if you don't have it? Yeah? Then that's a good guide to where kind of the attachments lie. Yeah? So, but I think it's also important when practicing renunciation, right, to exercise your renunciation muscles, right? Start with something small, yeah, and give that up. Oh, okay, that's all right. Good, you give that one thing up. Yeah? And then reinforce that. Keep it going. Remind yourself. Celebrate it. Give yourself some kudos. Yeah, good. You've given that one small thing up. Don't think lightly of it, because giving even a small thing up actually is a powerful force in the mind. See, this is the trick, right? When the mind has renunciation, it doesn't have attachment. So even if you're giving something small up, your mind is still inclining to renunciation. And you might think, oh, it's a very small thing. Yeah? Right? But it's still that inclining to renunciation. Yeah? So then keep on going, building up that basis of just renouncing small things, little things, until you become confident with that. Then you go, oh, okay, now what next? Yeah? So it's a practice. Yeah. All right. Yes, Adrian.
Curious,
Yes. Yes.
So, would it be fair to say that, was the Buddha the first one who was able to get into a jhana state, or were there
No.
other sages who were able to get into jhana state?
Others. Yeah. I mean, we saw that, Alara Kalama, and then specifically it says that they had those attainments. And with we also saw that even in the Aryaparayesana Sutta with the question that Ravi asked, that the samanas and brahmanas who are getting into those jhanas who are free from those sensual attachments. Yeah.
So I guess would it be fair to say that what makes the Buddha so, revolutionary is that he was able to kind of use that state after you get out of the jhana to be able to
Right.
have the right view.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not the state itself, but it's how you see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's other sages who have experienced that state of where the mind is like
Right.
they're being defined, but they're not able to kind of use that
Yeah.
to get there.
Because that's your preconditioning, right?
Yeah.
It reaffirms your priors. Yeah, and that's why, always encouraging right from the beginning to have that process of inquiry. And this is why I'm trying to teach you when we're looking at the suttas, always bring that process of inquiry, always challenge yourself. Why? Because those same skills of mind will be just as essential when you're meditating. Right? Because the same thing's going to happen to you when you meditate. You'll meditate, something will happen to you, and you'll be like, oh, this is that, and you'll attach to it. And if you haven't developed the habit of questioning and inquiring, that's when you hold on to those things. Yeah? So, I mean, just on a simple level, like if you're a Brahmin renunciate like Yajnavalkya or something, you go away, you meditate, you say goodbye to Maitreyi, and you go off and meditate in the forest, and you get into jhana, what do you say? You say, oh, this is Brahman. This is Brahman. I've experienced. This is it, right? Light, infinite light, everything. I mean, who wouldn't think that? Right? Yeah? If you're a Christian, you go away and meditate. Well, I saw God. Yeah? Of course that's what you'd think. Yeah? So this is why the Buddha's habit of inquiry and testing, never being satisfied, always inquiring and testing. He said, actually, this is just a state. It's just a conditioned state. Yeah? I mean, in a way, they're right. I mean, this is Brahma, actually. The state of jhana is what produces the Brahmas. That's why you get reborn as a Brahma god. So you're not wrong, but it's still impermanent. Okay, let us continue. Right action, refraining from killing living creatures, stealing, sexual misconduct. Right livelihood is when a noble disciple gives up wrong livelihood and earns a living by right livelihood. This is called right livelihood. Obviously, that's not perhaps a particularly satisfying definition in this case. With the Sangha, there is extensive definitions of and discussions of right livelihood and wrong livelihood. So making a living by telling fortunes, by selling amulets, by acting as a doctor, or these kinds of things is regarded as wrong livelihood, whereas right livelihood is to take your bowl and walk down the street and just accept whatever people give you. This is right livelihood. For lay people, it's obviously a bit more complicated because there are many different kinds of jobs that you can do. But the number one thing to remember, okay, is that right livelihood is one of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So that means your job is just as much a part of your practice of the Noble Eightfold Path as your meditation. Yeah? Actually, often more so, because you spend 8 hours a day at your job. You're not usually spending 8 hours a day meditating. Yeah? So it's no less a part of your spiritual path. And so don't think that my job is getting in the way of my spiritual practice. Actually, your job is your spiritual practice. It's literally right there in the Eightfold Path. Right? Yeah? And when you get up in the morning and you go to work, you should think, fantastic, I get to do Sama Ajiva. Now I get to practice this factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. Yeah? And many people think, oh, I'm doing my job and I get so stressed doing my job, then I have to meditate, right, to make the stress go away. This is miccha sankappa. Yeah? This is wrong thoughts based on attachment and misunderstanding. Your job is what makes your meditation possible. Right? I mean, if you have no job, have no income, what are you doing? You have nothing to eat, no place to stay, you can't meditate. Homeless people can't meditate. Right? I mean, they can try, but it's not going to get very far because there's no stability. So you need to have some kind of job or some kind of living or some kind of livelihood that's going to make it possible for you to meditate. And so don't think of your job as being an obstruction to your practice. Your job is one of the things, one of the necessary conditions that is part of the Eightfold Path that makes it possible for you to meditate. There's a list of the 5 kinds of wrong livelihood. Does anyone know the 5 kinds of wrong livelihood? Weapons? Slaves? Weed, did someone say? Good enough. Sorry? Livestock, yes. Trading in alcohol, yes. Yeah, alcohol and drugs, yep. So no being a drug dealer? No. And meat also, amongst the vanija, yeah. So no being a butcher, no being a live animal trader, no being a human trafficker. Sorry, no human trafficking. Alcohol and drugs, and poisons. Bad weapons and poisons, yeah. Visa vanija. So, so these are, obviously these are all trades which in themselves are very intrinsically harmful, right? There are many other trades which are not, they're a bit more of a grey area, right? It can be a bit one way or can be a bit the other way, and it kind of depends, right? So I think most people, most of their jobs are like that, you know? So obviously when you're doing a job, try to do your best, try not to break any precepts, try to do your job in a wholesome way. Like, you know, most of the kind of ordinary jobs that people do, you know, you can see they actually have a purpose, you know? And certainly any kind of blue collar work, like being a janitor or a cook or cleaner, a builder, a farmer, all of these are right livelihood, yeah? And I think sometimes, you know, we tend to sort of look down on or think that these are kind of lower forms of livelihood, but actually they make it possible for us every day, you know? So I always sort of make a point, like if I see people doing the cleaning or something like that, I always say thank you to them for doing their work, because I know that without that, they practice a right livelihood, we couldn't be doing all of these things. Other forms of work, you can do them in a good way or in a bad way. And I remember one time when I was in Malaysia, talking to one gentleman about this, and so I was just chatting, and what's his job? He says he works in advertising, and I'm like, He said, is that right livelihood? And I'm like, because most advertising is just rising desire, right? That's the purpose. Advertising is there to make you want things. Yeah? I'm like, not great. And so he said, but what I actually do is I work for the government. I work for the health department in advertising health programs for people. I said, oh, well, okay, that's all right then. Yeah? So it's not black and white, right? And you just try to do the best that you can. Like if you have the option, right? If you have the space and the time to set up something to do really right livelihood, then this is great, And there are some people who have the opportunity to try to do that. But even within that sphere, at least you try to be honest. You be respectful with people. Be respectful with your colleagues. You always try to act in a way that's genuinely beneficial for the people that you're working with. Yeah? And this is the way you can maintain right livelihood. Okay. Very good. Right action, right livelihood, we've done. Then right effort. So now we're getting on more to the specifically meditative part of the path. Okay. So far we've done the wisdom part and the sila part. Now right. And I won't go into all of these in too much detail because we will be discussing them all later on. So right effort, sama vayamo, is when a mendicant generates enthusiasm, tries, makes an effort, exerts the mind and strives so that bad, unskillful qualities don't arise. They generate enthusiasm so that bad, unskillful qualities that have arisen are given up. They generate enthusiasm so that skillful qualities arise, and they generate enthusiasm so that the skillful qualities that have arisen remain, are not lost but increased, mature, and are completed by development. This is called right effort. Right mindfulness is when a mendicant meditates by observing an aspect of the body, keen, aware, and mindful, rid of desire and aversion for the world. They meditate observing an aspect of feelings, mind, and principles, keen, aware, and mindful, rid of desire and aversion for the world. This is called right mindfulness. And what is right immersion? It's when a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption. And then enters in the second absorption and the third absorption and the fourth absorption, the fourth jhana. This is called right immersion. So the four jhanas are the definition of samma samadhi in the Noble Eightfold Path. This is called the noble truth of the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Nibbanaris in the Diyapakadisipatana, the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha, rolled forth the supreme wheel of Dhamma. And that wheel cannot be rolled back by any ascetic or Brahman or God or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world. It is the teaching, advocating, establishing, clarifying, analyzing, and revealing of the Four Noble Truths. That's what Venerable Sariputta said. Satisfied, the mendicants were happy with what Sariputta said. Yes. Go on.
Two terms, would you mind describing a little bit more? One is seclusion and the other is unified. Is seclusion like a continuum? Because like there's some medicants who go off in and less and less, very secluded. Or is it just more of a mental aspect?
Well, there's both kaya viveka and chitta viveka, right? So the bodily physical seclusion, right, which is going into the forest, going somewhere alone, and then mental seclusion, which really, mental seclusion, you can understand it in a general way as being a kind of aloof from things, but technically mental seclusion means the four jhanas. And then there's upadi viveka, the seclusion from the attachments, which is arahantship as well. So it really encompasses all of those kinds of things. So the answer really is yes, it is a spectrum. Yeah. So physical seclusion then supports that mental seclusion, right?
And then unified, I see a lot. My connotations, I've heard somewhere about meditation being body and mind being in the same place at the same time. But
Okay.
I'm not sure that that's what you
Right. Ekodi bhavang. So ekodi bhavang is what I'm translating as unified. Basically, it means come to a state of oneness. And in the concept of, I'll talk more about this later when I talk about the different jhana factors. But the state of oneness in jhanas implies one consciousness. So there's only mind consciousness, not 6 consciousnesses. Yeah? It implies also ekagata ramana, which means one object. So that means that not only is the mind, there's only mind consciousness, right? But that mind consciousness is only aware of one thing. So the mind consciousness itself is unchanging. Yeah? And it also, I think, means one unified in time. Yeah? Unified in time. The past and the present and the future have all collapsed. Yeah? Because it's just one steady experience. So within that experience, there's no perception of time. Yeah? I mean, obviously from outside, you can say, oh yes, they were sitting meditation for an hour, right? But the person inside that experience, it's like, time has gone. I mean, you experience that anyway on retreat, right? If you go on retreat and when you're meditating, time shifts, right? Your perception of time changes because your consciousness is changing, yeah? So I think all of those things are different aspects of ekaggata, but I'll talk more about that later on as well. Yeah. Adrian.
Curious how, like with right samadhi, it's the 4 jhanas but not the forms of things. There must be something about the jhanas that makes them more better.
Yeah, I think sometimes it is and sometimes not, but the 4 jhanas, it seems, are the kind of the baseline, you know, they're the central thing, yeah. Yeah. It's basically, you know, you have this idea of the ceto vimutti and panya vimutti, so those who are liberated by ceto, which essentially means by samadhi, and those liberated by wisdom. Now everybody who gets liberated has both samadhi and wisdom, right? So it's not one or the other, but it is also a matter of emphasis. So some people, if they have more wisdom, basically the more wisdom you have, the less samadhi you need. Yeah. So you know, maybe get into first jhana and then have an insight and then, you know, whereas somebody who has very slow wisdom maybe has to practice jhanas for many years to develop the insight. Yeah. Jhana and wisdom are different, yes. Well, they support each other, yeah? Nati jhanang apanyasa panya nati ajayato yam hi jhanancha panyancha nibbana seva santike. Okay, so this is one of the very basic analyses or explanations of the threefold training. And I'm sure you've all heard of the threefold training of Sila, Samadhi and Panya. And so here the Buddha is giving a fundamental explanation of that. So I'll just say a few words about this. So normally we talk about Sila, Samadhi and Panya. And here it has the higher ethics, the higher mind and the higher wisdom, the Adhi Sila Sikha, Adhi Chitta Sikha, Adhi Panya Sikha. I mean, in a way, it really just means the same thing. Sila, Samadhi, Panya, if it's explained, is just explained the same way. But Adhi Sila is emphasizing that it's an elevated training. Now, the idea of a training in Buddhism is really very simple. It's something that you do again and again, right? Sikkhapadang samadhiyami. Yeah? I'm just going to do it again and again. And one of the fundamentals of Buddhism is that the Buddha, as much as possible, okay, as much as possible, like to rely on the inner motivation of the people who are practicing. Yeah? He didn't like to make rules that are going to say do this and do that. Yeah? He was not a control freak. Okay? He would if he had to. If he had to lay down a rule for the Sangha, sometimes he would have to do that. Yeah? But he would not unless he really had to. Most of the time, he said, we have to want to do practice from inside. In fact, there's a sutta that talks about this where there's a monk who comes to the Buddha and says, Lord Buddha, you have made all of these rules for the monks, and there's too many, I can't keep them all. And the Buddha said, can you keep 3 rules? Adisila Sikha, Adipanya Sikha, Adichitta Sikha, Adipanya Sikha, training in the Sila Samadhi Panya. He says, I can do 3. He says, okay, good enough. Yeah? So the Buddha always wanted to call people out to try to do better. So the higher ethics, higher mind, higher wisdom, how can we elevate all of these things? Now, begin with the training in the higher ethics. Now, obviously, this is referring to the monastic ethics here, talking about a mendicant, a bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, and talking about the code of conduct, right? So the code of conduct is, of course, the Vinaya, but in this case specifically, the Patimokkha. Thank you, Patimokkha. Yeah? So the Patimokkha is the list of rules to be recited by the monks and nuns. So in the different Vinayas, they all have Patimokkha, and Patimokkha is usually mostly the same, and they have slightly different numbers of rules. But the different numbers of rules is almost always in the very minor matters of like table manners and things like that, but all the big rules are all the same. And there are 227 rules for bhikkhus, and bhikkhunis have 311. So generally speaking, now how I understand this, correct me if I'm wrong, if you have 5 precepts, yeah, then this is considered like a basic requirement of morality. Yeah? Then if you have 8 precepts, then you're keeping a higher standard of morality. Is that right? So if you're like at the meal time and you're going for the meal, then usually we would say if you're keeping 8 precepts, then you can go first, right? Because they don't eat in the afternoon, so 8 precepts go first. So if you're keeping 10 precepts, then that's even more. It's a high morality. So since I have 227, you have 311, then that means that you're keeping a higher morality than I do. So you should go first. Is that right? So you but it doesn't have to be. You could be my teacher as well. So, I mean, one of the things, I mean, I don't want to go into that kind of too much, but people say, why did bhikkhunis have so many more rules? Well, I think it's important to understand like what a rule is and how rules work, right? I mean, let's say you come from Australia, yeah? You're driving your car around on Australian roads. There are lots of road rules, right? Well, how many road rules are there? Thousands of them, yeah? You have to have your seatbelt the right colour. And there's the license plate has to be displayed a certain size, and you have to indicate before turning and all of these kinds of things. There's hundreds of road rules, but when you drive your car, you don't even think about it most of the time. You just drive. Yeah? But then maybe you go to another country where they don't have so many road rules. I'm not going to name any countries, okay? And where you can pretty much just find an empty place and go for it, you know? And so you ask yourself, is that easier? Is that nicer? Is that more fun to drive on the road? Well, maybe it is more fun to drive on the roads, but it's not safer. Yeah? So keeping rules is there for our benefit, right? And they're there to help us. Yeah? So it's not the case that having more rules is sort of harder or harsher or anything like that. It means you have more support and more help to live the holy life. And in any case, the difference in the rules, most of the different rules for bhikkhunis, I mean, again, without going into too much, but a lot of them are actually rules that the bhikkhus have as well. but they're not actually counted in the 227 rules. So there's a bunch of rules which are outside of those Patimokkha rules. And so things like ordination procedure and so on, which bhikkhunis have in their list of Patimokkha, we have similar rules, but we have outside the Patimokkha actually. So sometimes it's just a matter of how they're organized. Anyway. Okay, so that's the Patimokkha. And let me just give a quick breakdown of the rules for those who are not familiar with it. So the Patimokkha has different categories of rules. The most serious category of rules is the Parajika rules. If you break a Parajika offense, then you are immediately no longer ordained, and you can never ordain again in this lifetime. And there are 4 Parajika rules, which are sexual intercourse, stealing something, killing a human being, and making a false claim to superhuman attainments, okay, spiritual attainments. So these 4 Parajika offences. So if you do that, and these 4 Parajika offences can be very harsh, okay? Now imagine I was to go into a shop, okay, and I see this nice bell that they've got for sale, $10. $10 for this bell. I don't know how much a bell like that costs, I'm just making it up. $10. And then I think, oh, that's nice. I don't have $10. Maybe I'll steal it. Yeah? Oh, is anybody looking? No, okay. I'll steal it. I'll go like this. Okay? Now, if I go like that, then I've committed a Tulachaya offense. Okay? And I can still be redeemed. Okay? And if I think, no, this is wrong, and I put it back, then I'm okay. But if I go like that and I lift it up that far, then that's it. I'm done. That's Parajika already. Yeah? And then I think, no, it's wrong, I'll put it back, it's too late. Yeah? So it's very strong. Now that particular case would be actually ambiguous. Why? Because Parajika also depends on the value of it. Yeah? It's very hard to determine the value. The value, it says, like the value, I think, of a mango in a time of famine is one of them, right? So it gives various things about how much value something has, yeah? But the one I think which is the most relevant is it says that for which a government would arrest you, right? A prosecutable offence, okay? That's, I think, a reasonable requirement. So, but even that's very ambiguous. I said to a friend of mine, Maitri, a lawyer friend of ours, I said, how much do you have to steal before it's a prosecutable offence? He said, well, it depends. If you're a millionaire or a billionaire, you can swindle $1 million and no one's going to charge you. If you're an Aboriginal kid, you can nick a bag of lollies and they'll throw you in jail. So this really depends. But anyway, so you get the idea that basically as bhikkhus we shouldn't try to steal. It even says in the Vinaya that you should not even steal as much as a blade of grass. So this is the 4 Parajika offences. Then the next one we have is Sanghadisesa offences. I think the bhikkhus have 13 and the bhikkhunis have, I think, 17, right? 17 for bhikkhuni Vinaya. And so these are serious offences, but not quite as serious as the Parajika offences. So some of these involve building code violations, okay? So if you build a kuti that's too big, yeah, this is one of them. Again, a bit problematic because we don't quite know what the measurements that they were using. So it's a bit hard to say exactly how big the overly large kuti is. Another one is attempting to cause a schism in the Sangha, is another serious offence. And then there are various sexual matters which fall short of having sexual intercourse. So for example, if a monk speaks to a lady and says, using sort of flirtatious and seductive words, this kind of thing, then that kind of thing can be a Sanghadisesa offence as well. So these are the Sanghadisesa offences. And if you commit one of those, then you can be rehabilitated, but you have to be rehabilitated through the acts of a Sangha. So a Sangha has to accept, you have to go and ask for rehabilitation from the Sangha, and the Sangha has to grant that to you. Then you have a process of penance, which can last as long. So you have a fixed period of penance, and then you have a period. So the fixed period is 10 days, right? The manata? 10 days manata. Is that right? Or 7 days? You don't have it. What? Oh, I think get off easy, right? And then also you have another period which is as long as you've concealed the offence. So if you conceal the offence for 1 day, then you get 1 day extra. If you conceal the offence for 20 years, you get 20 years extra. Okay? And during that time of penance, basically you lose your position of seniority in the Sangha. So you have to sit at the end of the line, and other monks are not supposed to bow to you, and usually you'll get some like extra chores and these kinds of things. So it's not like, you know, very kind of serious or harsh punishment, but it's enough to know that it's a kind of your position within the Sangha is suspended for that period. So this is the Sangha Disesa. Then next one we have the Nisagya Patitya offences, 30 of them for bhikkhus, same for bhikkhunis, I think? Same for bhikkhunis. And so these Nisagya Patityas are concerning things for which there is a material object involved, okay? And so, for example, robes. If you have too many robes, then there's sort of an allowable way to accept robes, and you have too many, they have to be relinquished. Or if you have an extra bowl, right, you should only have one bowl, then if you have an extra one, then you have to relinquish that. So it's about various physical things that you have to relinquish. These are Nisagya Pachitya rules. Then there are the Pachitya rules, of which there are 92 for the bhikkhus. Oh, sorry, then there are the Aniyata rules. Aniyata. So the Aniyata rules, 2 of them are indeterminate rules. And so what these rules are only for the bhikkhus, and these rules concern the accusation that a laywoman brings against a bhikkhu. All right? So if a laywoman says, a credible laywoman says, accuses a bhikkhu of some kind of offence, typically an offence of a sexual manner, so it might be like that they were breaking, you know, they saw the bhikkhu having sex, or they saw the bhikkhu being, you know, behaving inappropriately or something like that. Or maybe they were like being harassed, or, you know, the bhikkhu was trying to seduce them or something like this. Then they can bring that accusation to the Sangha. And if that, once that accusation is brought to the Sangha must investigate it. Okay? The Sangha has an obligation to investigate that rule and to treat the bhikkhu as accordance with the act that he has done. So this is called the Aniyata, or uncertain rule. Yeah? So this is really interesting from perspective of like women's rights and so on, because this is basically, we see so often that even today this does not happen, right? Accusations are brought and yet nothing is done about it. Yeah? That 2,500 years ago, the Buddha made this rule. If there is an accusation, it doesn't mean that you assume guilt, but it means that you must investigate, based only on the word of a single woman. Then there is the Pachitya offences, 92 for the bhikkhus. How many for bhikkhunis? 166, something like that. Something like that, yeah, a lot anyway, yeah. Did you memorize the Patimokkha? Not yet. Do you have time this Vasa? Maybe, yeah, maybe this Vasa you can memorize, yeah. So 92 Pachitya offences. The Pachitya offences range from things such as like important moral precepts, like not lying, not killing, right? These are Pachitya offences. But also a lot of very kind of minor things. So things like, say, what's a good example of a minor one? Well, say, a lot of the ones that actually really shape the Sangha's lifestyle are found in the Pachitya offences. So, for example, Vikala Bhojana, not eating after noon, is a Pachitya offence. And what other ones? Or if you... so there's rules about things like what to do if you find something of value which has been left behind in the monastery, right? So you have to make sure that that's set aside for the owner, and then if you don't do that properly, this also is a Pachitya offence. Or if you make a robe that is too big, also a Pachitya offence. So various things like this can be included. So if you commit one of these offences, then you have to confess it, right? So and you either confess it when you do it, ideally, or you confess at the Uposatha each fortnight. And then there are 4 Patidesaniya rules, which are, again, minor rules, mostly about accepting food and accepting meal. Also can be confessed. And then a group of what we call Sekhiya rules. Sekhiya rules are essentially etiquette and table manners. things like the correct way to wear your robe or the correct way to eat your meal and so on. So things like, for example, you should be mindful when receiving alms food. Yeah? So sakachang pindabatam prigehesamiti. So these are the Sekhiya rules, and in addition there are 7 what they call adhikarana samattas, which are the means of settling issues or settling disputes in the Sangha. So these are 7 procedures which should be followed in the case of settling disputes. For example, one of those procedures is the sammukha vinaya, which means that procedures, allegations and issues in the Sangha must be settled face to face. Right? So you must settle any issue face to face with the monks or nuns who are concerned. You shouldn't do it when in their absence. So these kinds of principles are again built into the Vinaya, and this is part of how we're supposed to do things. So this is the Patimokkha, very kind of brief overview of the Patimokkha code. Okay, moving on. Good behavior, achara, again refers to the conduct. So this is like the etiquette, like behavior when you're walking on arms round and so on. And this one is a difficult one to translate, and I'm not at all happy with my translation, but I'm not at all happy with other translations either. So the Pali word here is actually very simple, is gochara, all right? Gochara. Now what gochara means, literally, is a cow wandering, a place that the cows wander, okay? Like a field, yeah? But it's like where the cows go to graze. So it's a grazing ground for the cows. Yeah? But what it really means is the places that the monk or the nun goes to for alms and the places that they kind of tend to hang out. Yeah? And so you shouldn't go to inappropriate places. So like, for example, if I'm in Harris Park, I shouldn't go and hang out at the pub. And hopefully, maybe they'll offer me a beer if I stay there long enough. So this would be considered an inappropriate gochara. Yeah? So it's a bit difficult. Bhikkhu Bodhi usually translates this as resort, but I'm not sure that really conveys the sense of it. Conduct and resort. I don't know. Resort's usually a place you go to relax on holiday. I don't know if people really get that sense from resort. So I put there supporters, but I'm not sure if that really is correct either. Anyway, but that's the meaning of it, is that the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis should be careful about how they associate. Seeing danger in the slightest fault, they keep the rules that they have undertaken. Okay, so this is the training in the higher ethics. Obviously, for the lay folk, then the basic principles of ethics are always the same: not killing, not stealing, and so on. But the detailed rules of the Patimokkha don't apply. Training in the higher mind is training in meditation, culminating in the practice of jhanas. And the training in the higher wisdom, again, obviously the development of wisdom, culminating in the realization of the Four Noble Truths. And once again, we will be discussing these things in more detail in later classes, so I won't talk about them in too much detail right now. But any questions before we move on? Yes, Deepika. Gochara supporters. Yeah. But it's not really, doesn't really mean that. It really means like the place that you go to where people are supporting you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly correct. That's what it means, is territory, yeah? So with good behavior and territory. It's hard to translate it in English, right? Territory, it's correct, that's what it means, but domain? Domain? Good behavior and domain? It does, yeah, domain does suggest ownership, yeah. This is the dukkha of the translator. I'm just sharing my dukkha with you so you can empathize, make me feel a bit better. So yeah, all these little ones, you really have to try to struggle with it. That's the kind of phrase that you could, maybe you just need to translate it with a phrase rather than a word, Good supporters and the place that you go for alms resort is really what it means. Stomping ground. good hangs, good behaviour and hangs.
So this suited more just what monks.
This one is, yeah. I mean, most of them are, right? Yeah. Most suttas are addressed to monks, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Oh, Anne, yeah. Right. Okay. So good question. So if a bhikkhu or bhikkhuni ordains and if they break a rule, if they haven't learned and they break a rule without intention, is that an offence? So the answer to that is it depends. There are certain rules that apply anyway, regardless of what your intention is. So, for example, all the parajika rules, they will still all apply, regardless of whether you know the rule or not. And then there are other ones where the intention is relevant, usually the more minor rules where the intention is relevant, particularly things like the rules on etiquette and so on. So these are generally like guidelines, but there's no particular offence. But it's also an offence to not know the rules. Yeah? So this is one of them, is that you should, because we're supposed to be attending the Uposatha every fortnight and listening to the Patimokkha being recited. And it's actually a rule, it's actually an offence. If you say, well, I didn't hear this rule, where's the first time I'm hearing about this, right? Then no, that's not good enough, yeah? Because it's your obligation to learn, yeah? And part of the obligation of when you ordain is that you have the upajjhaya, who is like, again, literally the meaning of upajjhaya is the close reciter. Literally upajjhaya means close reciter. And so the upajjhaya is someone who's supposed to take care of sharing with you these essential things. So even in the ordination ceremony itself, we teach the 4 parajika rules, or the 8 parajika rules for bhikkhunis, right? And so at least you know that much, okay? So otherwise you could just ruin everything that very day, right? And then you're finished. So at least you know that much. But then you're supposed to learn those rules, and it's your obligation as a student to learn, and the obligation of the sangha also to give you that information and knowledge. Yeah. Yes.
Bhante, I don't know if this is actual or not, but someone mentioned to me once that the Buddha said to his followers at some point, go forth and teach. And
He said what, sorry?
the Buddha said to his followers to go forth and teach.
All right, yeah. Charita, yeah.
And I just wondered under those circumstances, they would come back, right, of course, and be with the rest of the monastics, and they could implement these rules more easily, like, reciting the
Right.
putting in, asking for, asking for a review of the fast,
Right.
expressing remorse for that. But I'm just wondering if people, were to go forth and then not for long, not be part of that monastery organization, these support us for the religion that have not been placed there.
Right.
And I wondered how these situations can be handled, or are handled, were handled.
Sure, yeah. So again, the question is, what do you do if you're not in the, not in a community, not in a sangha? Then how do you handle dealing with these things? So again, these are situations. All of these situations are dealt with in the Vinaya itself, and so it gives you the guidelines. So we're supposed to, for example, each fortnight recite the rules of the Patimokkha, and that's something that the sangha usually keeps very strictly, and certainly in the traditions that I've been in, we will always recite the Patimokkha. And we will still recite it by heart, right? So we will memorize the Patimokkha and recite it by heart. Now, but that's only if you're in a community with 4 or more bhikkhus, right? If you're in a community with 3 or fewer bhikkhus, you don't recite the Patimokkha. But you have another procedure. So the Buddha in the Vinaya gives a procedure, what do you do on the Uposatha if there's only 3, what do you do if there's only 2, what do you do if there's only 1. And so this is all specified. Yeah? So if you're only 1, then it's very simple. You just say, today is my Uposatha. Ajame Uposatha. That's very simple. Yeah? But at least you're still marking it, right? You still remember when it is. But if you commit an offence, right, if you're staying alone and you commit an offence, if it's a minor offence, then you can wait until you see another monk before confessing it. But if it's a major offence, then you should make an effort to go and find a monk immediately that you can go and confess to. Yeah. Yep. But yes, it is a very real thing, yeah? And it was, as you said, it was there since the very early times, yeah. Who is she?
Sort of half answered my question, but it's a tricky one.
Yes.
If you're advising a monk or someone cares about this monk, if that bell thing is such like seems like a small thing, just give
All right.
a centimetre higher than they would otherwise, and put it down like what am I doing?
Yeah.
I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but
No, please.
would you really tell someone to then, like nobody saw it except you?
Okay. Nobody saw it.
Give up your whole, life as a monk for that, and say, hey, by the way, I lived at the 170.
Okay, I'll tell you a story about that. So again, the story from the Vinaya or the commentary or somewhere, I can't remember where. Anyway, so one of the stories about that was that there was a monk staying in a monastery, and the monk left the monastery, and when he left his sangati behind. So the sangati is the outer robe, the cloak, double cloaked robe, and quite valuable actually. Yeah, quite a lot of cloth and quite a lot of effort to sew it. And so he left travelling without his sangati, very unmindful. Yeah, should not do that. And then after he'd gone, another monk was, sometime later was like cleaning the kuti that he'd been in and saw this sangati and then thought, that looks like a nice sangati, maybe I'll take it for mine. And so he picks up this sangati and takes it. Afterwards he feels remorse. He says, oh my goodness, I think I'm parajika, I've stolen this sangati. And so he went to the preceptor and he confessed the offence of stealing the sangati. The precept heard what he said and, obviously what he did was wrong, right? There was no question about that. He shouldn't have stolen the sangati. Yeah, so, but the preceptor said, he needed to investigate first. And so he travelled afterwards and found that monk who had left the monastery and asked that monk, when you left that sangati, did you think it was still yours or not? And the monk said, actually after I walked down the road and I realised that I'd left it behind, so in my mind I had relinquished it. I didn't think of it as mine anymore. And so he said, okay. So in fact he said, no, you're not parajika, because he didn't own it. So that the Sangha always, and the leaders in the Sangha always should try to do what they can to make that as lenient as possible, right? Without bending or breaking the rules, right? But if you can, whatever you can, to try to help and support that person, that's what you should do. Yeah. And again, these things are right there in the Vinaya. The Vinaya has these instruments. People think of the Vinaya as being a kind of like a blunt or very legalistic system, and it's anything but. The Vinaya says, like even that question that Anne was asking, about someone who's new. The Vinaya says if somebody's new and gentle in faith, then you should be very slow to bring any accusation against them, yeah? And you should relinquish it very quickly. Yeah? And so it's actually really sensitive in how it handles all of those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, sometimes there are those very clear lines. Yeah. But if that does happen, then usually what would happen is that they might stay on as a samanera, but they still couldn't take bhikkhu ordination. Yeah. Okay. Adrian. I expect nothing less.
Just wondering, when you say, for example, you're on a plane, you're flying from Sydney to
Right.
Europe.
Right.
So that's like a long flight, right?
Right.
And like the plane's flying over the ocean.
Right.
You don't know what time zone you're in for. And then the stewardess, like,
Ah, it's as if you're reading my mind, Adrian, you're reading my mind. Ah, no, it's terrible. How does that work? And especially, I have to say, especially if, like, when I came to Sri Lanka, then the very kind people on the Sri Lankan Airlines upgraded me to business class. So it was very nice food. So yeah, that was very tempting. So yeah, in that kind of case, and it's, you know, it's also weird because depending on where you're flying to and from, then sometimes you miss your meal as well, right? Because depending on how the time zone's going. So look, in that kind of case, I don't think anyone would be too strict or too harsh about exactly how you're going to do things. Yeah, like you say, you just really have to do your best, you know. So for myself, you know, as long as it's sort of generally in the morning time, then I'll take the meal. But if it's, you know, if it's like in the evening dinner time, then I won't. Yeah. So yeah, a bit flexible in those things. But like I said, like that's only that's a pachitya offence. So if you do feel that you've broken it, you can confess it. It's okay. Yeah, as long as you don't make a habit of it. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you say that's silly, but that's exactly the kind of thing that monks like to talk about. And I remember one time when I visited, we had a Sangha conference, and I was just sitting there chatting with some of the monks, and Ajahn Brahm was there, and a few of the other monks were there, and we were just talking about this and that. And I happened to mention a website which I had seen recently, which was called Buddhism and Vampires. And it was looking at like the history of like these kind of supernatural creatures in Buddhism and so on, and then looking at symbology and these kinds of things. But because I was sitting talking with Theravada monks, it didn't take them long to start asking, now if a vampire ordained, would they be able to drink blood in the afternoon? I mean, it's not solid food, but for them, that's what keeps them alive. So it's kind of a grey area. Sorry? Are you human? That's true, actually. Yeah, you couldn't really ordain. Yeah. But what if you got turned into a vampire after you ordained? See, this is one of the other things, yeah? Right? So a little bit of a grey area there. Yeah? Right? Probably. Yeah. Right, yeah. Yes. Are you human? Well, according to the Vinaya, there was a Naga who transformed himself into the shape of a human, who came and ordained, and then after he ordained, he fell asleep and went back to his Naga form, and monks were like, "What?" So the Buddha said, "Look, I'm sorry, but you can't ordain as a Naga." Yeah. I know, right? It's very sad. Yeah. So, you know. But if you're going to allow the Nagas, then you actually have to the Yakas, and then you have to allow the Supanas, and the Rakshasas, and the Kumbhandas, and where does it stop? Right? Yes. Yes, Madhu. Yes, it's also a name for a tribe of human, that's true, yeah. So if you're a Naga human, then you're good. That's fine, that's fine. It's a name for a supernatural creature, like a dragon, yeah, that can transform its shape. Yeah. Yes, well, it's mentioned in the suttas. You know, they have the image with the Buddha with the big serpent around him and raising his hood above the Buddha. You know? That's what it says. Look, you know, as a textual scholar, I can say this is what it says in the text, yeah? As an empiricist, I can say I've never actually seen it happen myself. Okay, so whether it's a, so I think a lot of these stories in the Vinaya are there as illustrative stories, right? And a lot of the stories are quite wild, okay? And many of them, I do believe many of them are in fact responses to the questions by the bored novices at the back of the room. Okay? who was sitting there and asked the Vinaya master, but Bhante, what would happen if a Naga took the shape of a human and then ordained? And this is why these things get put in there. All right, so, okay, let's move on to the next sutta. So we were on the threefold training. Good. Now we can have a look at the gradual training. And the gradual training in the Sekha Sutta. So I've heard at one time the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans near Kapilavatthu in the Banyan Tree Monastery. Now at that time a new town hall had recently been constructed for the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu. It had not yet been occupied by any ascetic or Brahmin or any person at all. Then the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu went up, of course this being the Buddha's hometown, went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down on one side and said to him, "Sir, a new town hall has recently been constructed for the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu. It has not been occupied by anyone at all. May the Buddha be the first to use it, and only then will the Sakyans use it. This will be for the lasting welfare and happiness of the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu." So this is that traditional practice, so still done today, to invite the Sangha to come and do a service, maybe do a Dhamma talk or something, to bless a house or a place. So then the Sakyans bowed to the Buddha. They went to the new town hall where they spread carpets all over, prepared seats, set up a water jar and placed a lamp. They went back to the Buddha, told him of their preparations and said, "Please, sir, come at your convenience." The Buddha robed up, taking his bowl and robe, went to the new town hall together with the Sangha of mendicants. Having washed his feet, he entered the town hall and sat against the central column facing east. The Sangha of mendicants also washed their feet, entered the town hall, and sat on the west wall facing east with the Buddha right in front of them. The Sakyans of Kapilavatthu also washed their feet, entered the town hall, and sat against the east wall facing west with the Buddha right in front of them. So this is an interesting description, and again, these kind of little descriptions, it sort of tells you some idea of how they were performing these functions and how they would do, how they would arrange themselves when they're doing a Dhamma talk. Those little details quite interesting. So the town hall, incidentally, is the very similar in meaning to the English idea of the town hall, and then it's the Santagara, and this would have been the community hall where the Sakyans would carry out their business and their discussions and so on. So the Sakyans were an aristocratic republic, which means that the government was not by a single king, but was by a council of the leaders of the clans. So the clans and especially the landholding clans would have been run the republic together, and they would elect temporary Raja, we translate as king, but the Raja or the ruler they would elect on a temporary basis who would rule. So this is the method of governance of the Sakyan people and other peoples such as the Vajjian Republic. And this was the model, some of the aspects of this model that the Buddha modeled the Sangha after. So this is the Buddha's there giving that Dhamma talk. Then after giving some talk, he said to Ananda, Ananda, please speak about the practicing trainee to the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu as you feel inspired. My back is sore, I will stretch it. Yes, sir, Ananda replied. Then the Buddha spread out his outer robe folded in four and laid down in the lion's posture on the right side, placing one foot on top of the other, mindful and aware, and focused on the time of getting up. So interesting detail about the Buddha that occasionally he would do this during a Dhamma talk, right? He's been sitting there teaching for a while, he'd get a bad back, so he'll just have a bit of a lie down. I have to admit that one of my ambitions in life as a Dhamma teacher is to have enough confidence to be able to have a little bit of a lie down during a Dhamma talk when my back gets sore. But so far I feel too self-conscious, so I haven't been able to do that. But maybe we'll try that sometime. But Of course, this was parodied when Devadatta split the Sangha and went off with his own Sangha and tried to imitate the Buddha. And he did the same thing and told everyone, oh, my back's sore, I'm going to lie down. But then he just fell asleep and started snoring. So it didn't quite work out. Anyway, but again, interesting just to see how the Buddha is empowering and encouraging his students to give Dhamma talks. Yeah? As we saw before, he was asking Sariputta to teach. Here he's asking Ananda to teach. And as Tom mentioned earlier, this is something the Buddha actually encouraged the monks to do right from the beginning, to go forth and to teach. And the whole way that the Buddha set up the Sangha is he set up the Sangha to be able to govern itself, to hold the Patimokkha itself, to hold ordinations itself, to rehabilitate the Sangha itself. And it didn't require him, as the sole leader, to be making all the decisions. And this is why the Sangha has been so resilient and how it survived till the present day. Because the Buddha gave us his confidence that he felt we could do it. Yeah? He told us that we could do it. And so this, again, is that spirit that I'm trying to share with you during this course by getting you to write curriculums and these kinds of things. I'm trying to give you the confidence that you too can do it. All right. Ananda addressed Mahanama the Sakyan. A noble disciple is accomplished in ethics, guards sense doors, eats in moderation, and is dedicated to wakefulness. They have 7 good qualities, and they get the 4 absorptions, blissful meditations in the present life that belong to the higher mind, whenever they want, without trouble or difficulty. So here Ananda is teaching a version of what we call the gradual training, the Anupubba Sikha. But normally the gradual training is taught in the context of the bhikkhus. Right? Here, as he's addressing the lay folk, then instead of saying a bhikkhu is accomplished in ethics, he says a noble disciple is accomplished in ethics. Okay? So he's teaching for the Sakyans. Having said which, still, most of the teachings are still very similar to the ones that are given to the mendicants. So let's go through and see what this gradual training is. So again, gradual training is an expansion of the threefold training. So you've just seen the threefold training, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. The gradual training is an expansion of that. Beginning with ethics. How is a noble disciple accomplished in ethics? Is when a noble disciple is ethical, restrained in the monastic code, conducting themselves well and seeking alms in suitable places. Oh, that's better, isn't it? I haven't translated that consistently. I'm going to have to go back and fix that. Excuse me. Just let me make a note. Sorry about this. That's better, right? Seeking alms in suitable places. I forgot that I'd solved that problem. Okay, good. Okay. Seeing danger. Okay, there's a million words I've translated. I forget things, okay? So, seeing danger in the slightest fault, they keep the rules they've undertaken. That's how a noble disciple is ethical. So here, even though it's a teaching for lay folk, it's still talking about the monastic code. I'm not entirely sure about this, and I might want to check the Chinese parallels before making a comment on that, but it seems a bit odd, and I wonder whether that's a editing mistake. And it should really be the ethics for lay people there. But I'll just leave that aside for now. How does a noble disciple guard the sense doors? When a noble disciple sees a sight with their eyes, they don't get caught up in the features and details. Yeah? Na nimitta gahi. Yeah? They don't grasping the nimittas. Yeah? Na nanu bhyanjana gahi. If the faculty of sight were left unrestrained, bad, unskillful qualities of desire and aversion, abhijja domanasa, would become overwhelming. Yeah? Anvasaveyang, literally they sweep over you. For this reason, they practice restraint, protecting the faculty of sight and achieving its restraint. When they hear a sound with the ears, when they smell an odor with the nose, when they taste a flavor with the tongue, when they feel a touch with their body, when they know a thought with their mind, they don't get caught up in the features and details. If the faculty of the mind were left unrestrained, bad, unskillful qualities of desire and aversion would become overwhelming. For this reason, they practice restraint, protecting the faculty of mind and achieving its restraint. That's how a noble disciple guards the sense doors. So this is one of the fundamental practices which builds on the ethical precepts and is part of the development of one's conduct leading towards meditation. Okay, so the practice of sense restraint is a practice of applying mindfulness and care with how we use our senses. Our consciousness, our mind, sits in the middle of all of these senses. And it's being fed this food through all of these senses. And these senses make a huge impact on our minds. And what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, what we think, this is changing the nature of our consciousness. And if we are constantly being distracted, constantly being pulled one way or another, constantly having our mind being torn this way and that, then our mind becomes fractured. And so much of the stress, anxiety that we have comes from this fractured mind that's being pulled everywhere, every which way. You know, this is something I never really understood this until I'd done meditation. And then there was this one day, I remember this so clearly. Sometimes the things that happen to you in meditation, you remember years later. I was meditating in the hills in Pujamkom, in the national park near the Lao border. And sitting in my kuti, and then there's just one moment when everything like dropped away, and you can feel how soft your mind is. How incredibly soft and tender your mind is. And it was just this thing, I've never seen this before. And you realize that this mind, which is so tender, and yet we treat it so roughly. Yeah? We expose it to all of these things. We tear it this way and that. And we subject it to all of these stresses. But actually it's something which is so tender. And then why is it that we're distressed? Why is it that we're tired? Why is it that we're anxious? It's because we don't allow our mind to be peaceful, to be still. Yeah? And so this is one of the foundational practices leading up to meditation. And it's a point that I'm going to keep making again and again. We're talking about early Buddhist meditation. And one of the things that we hear about in modern times, people say that people will teach these meditation methods, teach these meditation techniques. And often people say, oh, there's not so much meditation techniques in the suttas, right? There's no details of meditation techniques. Actually, there are. Not so much, right? Not so much that we have like later. But actually, I think the problem is that it's not that we're missing those meditation techniques, it's that there are other things the Buddha was focused on, which are actually more important. Yeah? Sense restraint being one of them. It doesn't matter how clever your technique is. Yeah? It doesn't matter how sophisticated, how careful, how well constructed your technique is. If you're going about getting your mind scattered and getting your mind pulled everywhere and everything, you come to sit meditation, your mind's going to be all over the place. Yeah? But on the other hand, if you keep your mind calm, yeah, you keep your mind restrained, you look after it and take care of it all the time, not just in the meditation, right? Then when you come to meditate, easy. Your mind is already peaceful. Yeah? Why do you think the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis like to cheat by going off and living in the forest? Yeah? It makes this easy. Sense restraint's easy in the forest. Look at the tree. It's nice and peaceful. Yeah? It makes you feel nice. You look at the sky. It's nice. It makes you feel nice. And these things are the natural support for meditation. And so this is why I think that these supporting practices are what the Buddha emphasized, rather than too much about the details of meditation. Yeah? Any question about this before we go on? Okay, so anyway, we're here on retreat, a few days. We get the chance to practice sense restraint. It's a quiet environment here, not too much going on. And so it gives us some time to just settle down. All right. Next one. How does a noble disciple eat in moderation? Bhojane mattanyu hoti. That's when a noble disciple reflects properly on the food that they eat, not for fun, indulgence, adornment, or decoration, but only to sustain this body, to avoid harm, and to support spiritual practice. In this way, I shall put an end to old discomfort and not give rise to new discomfort, and I will live blamelessly and at ease. That's how a noble disciple eats in moderation. Okay? One of the things that I've sort of noticed in spiritual circles, people tend to get, or not everyone, but a lot of people, or some people, tend to get quite obsessive about food. I don't know if you've noticed that, but in monasteries and temples and Dhamma centers and things like that, people's mind tends to get really hung up about food. And like if you're going on meditation retreat, after a day or two, that's all you can think about. I know that was the case certainly for me when I first started meditating. And for the first 2 or 3 years, it was just food, right? It was just like, go back to your kuti, meditate, think about food, and then come for the meal the next day. I mean, well, not quite that bad, but it was not far off it. And so people often proliferate with views about food, right? It's got to be like this, it's got to be like that, we've got to have raw food, we've got to have keto, we've got to have all of these things that you can kind of proliferate about. So the Buddha's main thing about food was just moderation, yeah? Just reflect, okay, so this is the purpose of it. Questions? Okay. Yes. Beautification, yeah. I think I've called it in fun, indulgence, adornment, or decoration. Vibhusanaya, yeah. You could translate it as beautification, yeah. Right. Yeah, I remember something like that as well. Can you remember exactly what it was? Namandanaya. Right, yeah, I remember something about that as well, yeah. Yeah, so these are some of the questions that we want to take. So in that case, if we assume that there's another reading which may be more, which we may think is historically more correct, but do we then do that in our translation of the Pali? Yeah, so this is the thing. Even if we can prove that's the case, then generally speaking, my policy would be to translate what's actually in the Pali. Partly because otherwise then you can't see the differences if you look at the translations across them. Yeah. So I might translate from the Pali, maybe put a note if that's the case. Yeah, I do remember that, what you're saying, but I just can't remember the details of it. But yeah, that's right. I mean, there are some cases, like in this case it makes sense. There are some cases where it's something that just doesn't make sense, and so you can only really translate it with the help of maybe a Sanskrit text or something. Not often, but occasionally. Well, so that you look nice. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. But yeah, that's the thing. It's a little bit out of place. Yeah. Okay. How is a noble disciple dedicated to wakefulness? It's when a noble disciple practices walking and sitting meditation by day, purifying their mind from obstacles. In the evening, they continue to practice walking and sitting meditation. In the middle of the night, they lie down in the lion's posture on the right side, placing one foot on top of the other, mindful and aware and focused on the time of getting up. In the last part of the night, they get up and continue to practice walking and sitting meditation, purifying their mind from obstacles. That's how a noble disciple is dedicated to wakefulness. So again, this is part of that essential practice, like meditating through the day, and that the practice of lying down in the lion's posture. We saw that, of course, that's as the Buddha did when he was lying down there. There he is, lying down in the lion's posture, and focused on the time of getting up. So this is the traditional means. Instead of having an alarm clock, you have in your mind, you train yourself so that you know when is the time to get up. Can do. Yeah, not a superhuman power, actually quite easy to do. Yeah. Anyone here can do that? Train yourself to get up by a particular time? You can? Lynn can? Yeah. Yeah, usually I don't use an alarm clock. Occasionally if I'm like if I come here, for example, it's a different time zone and so on, so it's a bit less reliable. But most of the time then I don't need an alarm clock.
Bhante, you may talk about the lion's posture, how
Yes.
the hands are kept, nothing.
Doesn't mention, yeah, but like the Buddha in the Parinibbana pose. Yeah. So the idea is that you're still composed and you're still mindful while you're lying down, not just sprawling out.
Interesting in the sutta, in that previous morning's one, it talks Ananda gets through and meditates. Obviously, Buddha also spent a lot of time after enlightenment also.
Also meditating. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And he kept practicing meditation for two reasons. Number one, because he liked it. And number two, out of compassion for future generations. Yeah. Giovanni.
Do monastics try to sleep in the lion posture?
Yes. Yeah.
Because there's a sutta, I think, where the Buddha says that it's like you should sleep like all night in like lying on the right side. You cannot like if you wake up
Yeah.
and you're in another position, that's not correct.
I don't know, is there a sort of like that? I don't think so.
It says I don't remember exactly, but it's like it says something similar. Like if the disciple wakes up and they're not lying on the right side, then they need to train more because they're not.
I don't think that's in a sutta, but I maybe have forgotten. Maybe it was like a teacher was teaching that. But yeah.
It says like if you're on your back, that means it's strong. If you're on the left side, that means to breathe.
Something like that? Yeah.
I'm not mixed up, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like 2 or 3 that.
Yeah. But it's it's a guideline, it's not an absolute, but obviously the main thing is that you're composed and mindful. Yeah. Yeah. According to this, right? 4 hours. Yeah. Like if you're doing a lot of meditation, if you're on retreat, then that's enough. Yeah. And notice also just that walking and sitting meditation are both the kind of standard practices. Yeah. So it's not just sitting meditation. All right. So this is again, and again the Buddha's practice is based on this continuity, right? This regularity. So this is an ideal situation, and obviously it was never the time, in the time of the Buddha that all of the monks and all of the nuns were just meditating all day and all night, right? That never happened, right? But you would have periods of time on retreat when you can just meditate all day and all night. And outside of that, then you try not to get too distracted by other things and to still keep that meditation practice going as best you can. Okay. Moving on, how does a noble disciple have 7 good qualities? It's when a noble disciple has faith in the realized one's awakening. And so here the Ananda is coming, this is a departure from the normal teaching of the gradual training, and Ananda is now introducing qualities which are more suitable for lay followers. Has faith in the realized one's awakening. That blessed one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. Itipiso bhagava arahang sama sambuddho. They have a conscience, hirima hoti. They're conscientious about bad conduct by way of body, speech and mind, and conscientious about having any bad and unskillful qualities. They exercise prudence, otapi hoti. They're prudent when it comes to bad conduct by way of body, speech and mind, and prudent when it comes to acquiring any bad, unskillful qualities. They're very learned, remembering and keeping what they've learnt. Bahusuto hoti sutta dharo sutta sannichayo. These teachings are good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, meaningful and well phrased, describing a spiritual practice that's entirely full and pure. They're very learned in such teachings, remembering them, reinforcing them by recitation, mentally scrutinizing them, and comprehending them theoretically. Ditthya suppatividha, penetrating them by view. So this, again, is a quality of not just for the Sangha, but also for the lay people, remembering the teachings, and again, noticing that emphasis, as always in Buddhism, that emphasis on the active learning, right? Memorizing them, reinforcing them, reciting them, scrutinizing them, manas anupekita, and comprehending them with your view, with the theory. They live with energy roused up for giving up unskillful qualities and embracing skillful qualities. They're strong, staunchly vigorous, not slacking off when it comes to developing skillful qualities. They're mindful. They have utmost mindfulness and alertness and can remember and recall what was said and done long ago. They're wise. They have the wisdom of arising and passing away, which is noble, penetrative, and leads to the complete ending of suffering. That's how a noble disciple has 7 good qualities. All right, so here, remember, Ananda is now filling out the details of the scheme that he presented at the beginning. He talked about the gradual training, the 7 good qualities, then the 4 absorptions. The noble disciple enters the remains in the first absorption, second, third, fourth absorption. Then, when a noble disciple is accomplished in ethics, guards the sense doors, eats in moderation, and is dedicated to wakefulness, and they have 7 good qualities, and they get the 4 absorptions, blissful meditations in the present life that belong to the higher mind, whenever they want, without trouble or difficulty. They are called a noble disciple who is a practicing trainee. So it's a seko patipado. Their eggs are unspoiled, and they are capable of breaking out of their shell, becoming awakened, and achieving the supreme sanctuary. Suppose there was a chicken with 8 or 10 or 12 eggs, and she properly sat on them to keep them warm and incubated. Even if that chicken doesn't wish, if only my chicks could break out of the eggshell with their claws and beak and hatch safely, still they can break out and hatch safely. In the same way, when a noble disciple is practicing all these things, they're called a noble disciple who is a practicing trainee. Their eggs are unspoiled, and they are capable of breaking out of their shell, becoming awakened, and achieving the supreme sanctuary. Relying on this, so this is a simile which the Buddha gives a number of times in the suttas. Interesting simile, and one of the purposes of that is it's about the relationship that we have to our vows, right? So you can vow all you like. I'm going to meditate this much. I'm going to practice this much. I'm going to do this much, right? But it's not really going to make any difference. What matters is to actually do the practice. And as long as we are still doing that, like the chicken sitting on the eggs, yeah, the eggs are going to hatch. We just have to be patient. And so sometimes, this is also a reminder, right, that the good things take time. Yeah? Sometimes we want to push it. Sometimes we want our chicks to hatch right away. But what else can I do? What more can I do? But actually, we're doing all we need to. We just need to keep sitting there, be patient. The chicks will break out. And relying on this supreme purity of mindfulness and equanimity, that noble disciple recollects their many kinds of past lives. So again, this is like a technical phrase, anuttarang upekha sati parisudhing. Okay, so this is a phrase from the fourth jhana. So it's already talked about the four jhanas through there, and this is referring back to that. So with relying on this, iman yeva anuttarang upekha sati parisudhing. So it's emphasizing, that same mindfulness and equanimity that you had before, relying on that, agama, then one recollects the various kinds of past lives. So the recollection of past lives and these high knowledges in the suttas are usually said to be developed on the basis of the fourth jhana. And that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 rebirths, many eons of the world contracting, many eons of the world expanding, many eons of the world contracting and expanding. So they recollect their many kinds of past lives with features and details. This is their first breaking out, like a chick from an eggshell. Relying on this supreme purity of mindfulness and equanimity, that noble disciple with clairvoyance that is purified and superhuman sees sentient beings passing away and being reborn, inferior and superior, beautiful and ugly, in a good place or a bad place. They understand how sentient beings are reborn according to their deeds. This is their second breaking out, like a chick from an eggshell. And I'll just make a note on the translation here. I translate the dibba chakku as clairvoyance, the dibba sota as clairaudience, these are actually the normal words. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi has the divine eye and the divine ear, but clairvoyance and clairaudience are in fact the same. They're basically exactly the same. Dibba means divine, but the word dibba is also from the root bright or clear. So dibba chakku is actually literally clairvoyance and clairaudience. So this is why I've translated it that way. That noble disciple realizes the undefiled freedom of heart and freedom by wisdom in this very life, and they live having realized it with their own insight due to the ending of defilements. This is their third breaking out, like a chick from an eggshell. So this is the te vidya, the three knowledges. Noble disciple's conduct includes the following: being accomplished in ethics, guarding the sense doors, moderation in eating, being dedicated to wakefulness, having 7 good qualities, and getting the 4 absorptions when they want without trouble or difficulty. A noble disciple's knowledge includes the following. So the first one is that the conduct includes these following. So the Buddha here is defining what is conduct, right? Remember when we do our chanting, we say the Buddha is vijja charana sampanno, accomplished in knowledge and conduct. So here the Buddha is defining what those things are. So conduct includes the ethics, sense doors, moderation, eating, being dedicated to wakefulness, having 7 good qualities, and getting the 4 jhanas. So these are concluded under conduct. And the knowledge, the vidya, includes the recollecting past lives, clairvoyance, and realizing the undefiled freedom of heart and freedom by wisdom in this very life due to the ending of defilements. This noble disciple is said to be vidya sampanno, accomplished in knowledge, and also charana sampanno, accomplished in conduct, and also accomplished in knowledge and conduct, vidya charana sampanno. So attained to the same accomplished in knowledge and conduct as the Buddha has. And Brahma Sanankumara also spoke this verse. The aristocrat is first among people who take clan as the standard, but one accomplished in knowledge and conduct is first among gods and humans. That verse was well sung by Brahma Sanankumara, not poorly sung, well spoken, not poorly spoken, beneficial, not harmful, and it was approved by the Buddha. Then the Buddha got up and said to Venerable Ananda, Good, good, Ananda. It's good that you spoke to the Sakyans of Kapilavatthu about the practicing trainee. That is what the Venerable Ananda said, and the teacher approved, satisfied. The Sakyans were happy with what Venerable Ananda said. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Again, just a little translation issue, or something that's interesting for me. Where this little phrase at the end, it says Attamana, happy in mind, then they bhasitang abhinandung. Yeah? What does it actually mean to say they were abhinandung? I mean, obviously it means that they were happy with it. I think it actually, like in English, I think it would mean that they applauded what he said. Actually, what it means. I think it means actually more than being happy. I think it means that they expressed their happiness. I don't think they necessarily were like clapping, right? But they probably went like sadhu or something like that. Yeah, they probably expressed that. I wasn't quite sure how to express that in English, so they expressed their satisfaction or something with what Ananda said. Okay, very good. So this is the Seka Sutta. Okay. We're getting close to the time of the ending, and we have one more sutta to go. I'm just going to briefly touch on this sutta because we've already touched on it a little bit. I won't go in too much detail, but this is the analysis of the 5 spiritual faculties of Panchindriyani: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom, as we have seen before. Briefly, they are defined. Faith is defined as having faith in the Buddha's awakening. Again, itipiso bhagava. Faculty of energy. One lives with energy roused up for giving up unskillful qualities. We've seen this before. Mindfulness, again. Here we have a different definition of mindfulness. When a noble disciple is mindful, they have utmost mindfulness and alertness and can remember and recall what was said and done long ago. This is called the faculty of mindfulness. So these 2 aspects of mindfulness. One is the aspect of bearing something in mind in the present, but also that ability to recall something from long ago. We'll talk more about this in the session on mindfulness. The faculty of immersion, the samadhindriya, again, a slightly different definition. Normally it's defined in terms of the 4 jhanas. But here it says, it's when a noble disciple, vosagga rammanang karitva labhati samadhing labhati chittase kaggatam. Relying on letting go gains immersion, gains unification of mind. This is called the faculty of immersion. Yeah? So this is, I think, a nice, I like this definition of samadhi, especially that line, vosagga rammanang karitva, yeah? Relying on letting go. Yeah. Faculty of wisdom, they have the wisdom of rising and passing away, which is noble, penetrative, and leads to the complete ending of suffering. So this is the, it's not actually called, I don't think, a Vibhanga. Oh yes, it is called Vibhanga. So this is the Patama Vibhanga Sutta, the first Vibhanga Sutta for the Indriyas. So I mentioned before how the Vibhanga Suttas will define each of these things. So this is the 5 spiritual faculties: faith, energy, mindfulness, immersion, and wisdom.